I chose to go with the golden child and fled my poisonous family. They are pleading with me to return now. Thus, it appears that this tale has taken a while to develop. It's not easy to put it all out there, to be honest. However, I must get this off my chest. I never really felt like I belonged in my family when I was growing up. Jenny is my twin sister, Dot. We are not the same, and you would never suspect, I promise. Simply by observing each other, we are related. She seems like one of those females you see on Instagram or something. Always seems flawless, tall and blonde, essentially the entire bundle. I'm 52 years old, have brown hair, and resemble the prior photo more now. Additionally, those makeover programs. It's not as though I'm looking for favors or anything, dotted, quote, S, just the way I was raised. Everyone usually noticed her first. And that encompasses my parents from our early years. Who the family star was quite evident. Jenny seemed to be the focal point of every picture, every family film, and every memory we created. I was only present. It stung, but I think I got used to it. Worst of all, I believe, was that nobody seemed to be paying attention. Not my parents, not my companions, nobody. One birthday comes to mind. My parents hosted a lavish celebration for the two of us. I believe it was our 12th birthday. However, it didn't feel at all like my celebration. They talked about how gorgeous Jenny looked, made sure her hair was done, and spent a lot of time finding her the ideal dress, me. They said I could choose something for myself if I wanted to, and they handed me a Target gift card. For me, that was kind of the standard, never having to settle for leftovers. Conversely, Jenny was the kind of person that people simply enjoyed being around. Everyone would automatically gravitate toward her the moment she walked into a room, not that I despised her for it. Yes, perhaps a little. However, what truly bothered me was the way our parents encouraged it. They were enamored with her level of attentiveness. How everything appeared to revolve around her all the time. Additionally, I believe that they began to perceive me more as a supporting role in my own life. I've always been more reserved, but it didn't bother me to spend time by myself or read a book. I felt like I was constantly being compared to Jenny, though, even when I did make an effort to attract some attention. My mother would say something like, "Don't you think Jenny looks amazing in that?" whenever she was wearing something new. Perhaps you ought to attempt dressed like her. Or at family get-togethers, they would wax poetic about how gorgeous and prosperous she was becoming as she grew older. And then give me a quick glance, as if I were just riding along. I believe I first became aware of how things were different for us in middle school. Jenny received all the support she needed, either for her friends who cheered or for her own endeavors. Every single one of her games had our parents seated front and center, supporting her as if she were going to win an Olympic gold medal. They never stopped by to observe me while I was competing at meets as a member of the track team, not even once. This one time I had a big race, which I will never forget. I had been practicing for weeks and I was eager to show them what I could accomplish, which is why I was so happy. I let them know about it, confirmed the time and location, and even asked if they could bring a camera so they could take some photos. When the race day finally arrived, I peered into the stands prior to the start, and what do you know? They had vanished from view. They were at one of Jenny's cheerleading practices, I discovered later, not even a match, a routine. I became aware of how much they really didn't care at that point. Nor was it only the attention that mattered. It was made extra clearer by the manner they squandered our money, assuming we were heading shopping. Jenny would invariably end up with the priciest items, designer clothing, brand new shoes, you name it. After they'd spent the lion's share of the budget on her, I'd get the necessities. When I asked my mother why I wasn't able to receive the same things, she answered me straight out. Jenny needs to look better because more people are noticing her. It seemed as though they were indifferent to my feelings. I was merely there to take up space. It makes sense now why I thought I didn't matter. For a long while, I made an effort to ignore it, convincing myself that perhaps I was just being overly sensitive or overreacting. It wasn't just me, though. All those in our vicinity regarded Jenny as if she were the sun, and all I was a random planet passing through her space. The worst thing was that I began to accept it. I reasoned that maybe my lack of popularity or beauty made me less valuable. I could try harder and maybe they would notice. I began working harder in school and earning good grades in the hopes that eventually they would treat me with the same consideration as they did Jenny. However, it was unsuccessful. I received nothing more than a pat on the back even after I brought home consecutive as dot, while they were still infatuated with Jenny for winning the yearbook vote for most likely to succeed. I'm not lying. It seriously confused me. I couldn't help but question why my family wasn't regarded equally to siblings when I saw other families that were. Why did it take so much effort on my part to receive a little portion of the attention she received without even trying? I eventually just started to back away from it. I would stay away from family meals and get-togethers where I knew Jenny would be the life of the party and instead spend more time alone in my room. Although I didn't detest her, I did not like the status quo. When you feel invisible next to someone who is so radiant, it's difficult to stay silent. One particular recollection still remains with me. It was the summer before our first year of senior year. Jenny had gotten a full new wardrobe as usual when my mom went shopping for school clothes, trademarks, every recent trend. When it was my time, I came away with a few pants and t-shirts off the sale rack. My mother shrugged and stated, "You don't really care about clothes as much as Jenny does," in response to my question about why Jenny received so much more. I was certain at that point that nothing would ever change. It was more than just Jenny's popularity or beauty that caused me to grow up in her shadow. It was about the millions of small ways my parents consistently demonstrated to me why she was more important. And I was always going to be second best, no matter what I accomplished. My breaking point wasn't caused by a single event. It seemed like a series of insignificant events building up to something overwhelming. My turning 18 was a breaking moment for me. However, allow me to explain how it came to pass. So it was hard growing up with Jenny, but things really got worse when we got to high school. I was still the uncomfortable, silent one, and by that point she had this large network of friends I quote V never really fit in. It seemed like everyone knew me as Jenny's sister, no matter how hard I tried. I was unknown to most people. I believe my parents thought I should stay in the background and let Jenny take center stage. And to be honest, I did for a bit. Why oppose it? I reasoned. Neither she nor they were going to change. However, by my final year, I was preparing to move out. It has been in the works for some time. I kept it a secret from everyone, even my pals. I didn't want to take the chance of my parents learning before I was ready. I was saving all penny I could while working part-time at a nearby coffee shop. Though it wasn't much, it was sufficient to release me. After I moved out, I realized I couldn't count on my parents to support me. I was forced to handle it alone. Anyway, my 18th birthday was the breaking point. As usual, my parents planned to throw me and Jenny a joint celebration. Naturally, though, it seemed like the celebration was more for her than for me. All of her friends, the majority of whom hardly knew I existed, were invited, and she was the center of attention. Once more, I recall watching Jenny in her new, expensive outfit, taking photos and smiling with her friends as I stood in the corner of our backyard. I was confined to this worn-out outfit that I had purchased from a major store's sales section in the interim. I turned to face the dessert. The first name inscribed in large, ornate letters was Jenny's. Mine was tucked away like a forgotten thought in the corner. I made an effort to be upbeat. Since it was also my birthday, am I right? Perhaps they had something special in store for me. But there was no denying the difference in how they treated us when it came time to open presents. Jenny went first and received an abundance of gifts, naturally. A brand new purse made of clothes that I can't even pronounce is a designer brand. Next, it was my time. I wasn't expecting much, therefore I was shocked by what I received. I was given a $100 bookshop gift card by my folks. I adore books, but it was difficult to ignore Jenny's recent gift giving of a $1,000 gift card to her favorite store. They made an attempt to defend it by stating, "You enjoy reading. We so believed that this would be ideal for you." I gave a nod. Thank you, but I was boiling inside. The gift card itself wasn't the main concern. It concerned what it stood for. They seemed to be telling me that my value was diminished, that I didn't deserve to receive more than $100. But Jenny received 10 times that. It felt like a face slap. I walked up to my room and packed after the party. I wanted to stop wasting time. Since I was now formally 18, I'd been saving for months and there was no stopping me. That evening, I didn't tell my folks. I just packed my entire belongings into 2 suitcases and made plans to head out as soon as the sun rose. I got up early the following day in the hopes of leaving before anyone else did. Naturally, though, nothing goes as planned. My dad caught me heading down the stairs. "With all of that, where are you heading?" Glancing at the suitcases, he questioned. I froze for a moment before inhaling deeply. "I'm heading out. I had to leave this place, . My father's expression changed from perplexity to shock. "What topic are you discussing? You are now 18. Whatever you need, we can assist you with college. This is not required of you." "Help me," I replied, meeting his gaze. "As you have supported me over the years, not in my opinion." Even though my voice was trembling, I continued. "I can no longer put up with it since you've made it quite obvious where I stand in this family. I'm over being the backup plan." He was at a loss for words. He was stunned and stood there. My mother entered the room after me, so she must have heard the commotion, appearing equally perplexed. I said it again. "I'm heading out." My mother attempted to use the guilt trip. "You cannot simply leave us in this state. We cherish you. We are your household." I chuckled. I couldn't help it, even though it wasn't humorous. "Kin, you've been quite kind to Jenny. Additionally, I've been treated as though I'm unintelligent and irrelevant. I'm through." Both of them attempted to persuade me to stay, but I was set on leaving. They couldn't try to talk me out of it. Taking my bags, I exited via the front door, leaving everything I knew behind. Though I didn't really have a plan, I was certain that I wouldn't be returning. That morning, I boarded a bus and traveled for almost 4 hours to a little village. It was far enough that I didn't have to worry about running into someone I knew. It wasn't fancy or anything. I located a budget apartment. To be honest, it resembled a shoebox with a bed. But all that mattered to me was that it was mine. For the first time in my life, it seemed as though a burden had been removed from my shoulders. I had no restrictions. I was free from living under Jenny's shadow. I didn't have to put up with the continual partiality, comparison, or invisible sensation. It worried me to be on my own now. But it felt wonderful too. The following few weeks were spent adjusting to my new existence. I worked a part-time job at a grocery shop while attempting to decide on my next course of action. I ignored all of the calls and texts from my folks. I was not prepared to speak with them. To be honest, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to speak with them in the future. I felt a little bit stronger every day. I was at last beginning to come to terms with who I was. Distant from my kin. Keep away from Jenny's shadow. Though it wasn't simple, I felt pleased with myself for making the decision. I didn't have much money, but what was more valuable to me than anything they could have given me was peace of mind. Glancing back. Leaving through the door was the wisest choice I have ever made. It was more than simply moving away from my parents. It was also my first time deciding who I wanted to be. I was prepared to face the future on my own terms, even if I had no idea what it held. There was this unsettling quiet after I left my house. I suppose I was anticipating something spectacular, like my parents dropping by my new apartment or calling all the time. However, that did not occur. Perhaps a part of me was happy that they didn't attempt to pull me back, but there was also a part of me that kind of questioned whether they even cared. After departing, the first few days were bizarre. Really, all I had in my little apartment was a bed, a faulty faucet, and 4 walls. However, I owned it. I recall thinking, what now? As I sat there in the silence. It wasn't as though I had some big scheme. All I wanted to do was leave. But what happens after you're gone? That was something I thought about for a long time, particularly in the beginning when it was just the 2 of us. Even though I didn't have much money, I was nevertheless able to support myself by working part-time at a grocery shop. Though unglamorous, it was a source of income. I needed to be occupied, and it kept me busy. I was unable to cope with the emotions that came with leaving my family behind because I had too much free time, which led to excessive pondering. During the initial months, I ignored my parents' attempts to get in touch with me. They texted and called. I even attempted emailing, but I was uninterested. I had changed my phone number, banned them on social media, and even instructed the landlord not to provide my information to anyone contacting me. I really did want to sever relations. However, the quiet, Yes, it was a difficult part. It was somewhat liberating, as I had anticipated. I could breathe again, and I didn't have to put up with being compared to Jenny all the time. However, there was also this lingering sense of emptiness. It was there, nagging at me, something I didn't think I would miss. Not enough to make me turn around, but enough to make me question what in the world I should be doing right now. During those months, I was by myself a lot, contemplating things. It resembled reviewing the past and attempting to make sense of everything. I would sit there and replay past experiences, attempting to decipher what went wrong. Why did Jenny always have the upper hand? Why, despite everything I tried, did I never seem to measure up? Suddenly one day I was going to a therapist. Even though I wasn't ready to talk to my family, I reasoned that I might as well talk to someone. I wasn't hoping for a major achievement or anything. All I needed to know was why everything hurts so terribly even now, even after I had left. Though it wasn't a miracle cure, therapy helped make things a bit clearer for me. I began to see that Jenny and my parents weren't the only ones who had issues. It was the way they improved my self-esteem. I had been under the impression for a very long time that I wasn't significant or good enough, that I had accepted it as part of myself. How can you believe anything else when your own family treats you like you don't matter? I started to realize that their behavior of me wasn't a reflection of who I was the more I talked about it. It was an image of who they were. They each had their own problems and motivations for taking sides. However, that did not make me any less valued. I needed a considerable amount of time to process the information. I believe that I will always have some difficulty with it. That first year away, I didn't take any significant chances. I did my shifts, kept my head down, and said nothing. Though I wasn't exactly living life to the fullest, I did have a few pals. I just kept to myself most of the time. I required the room, even though it meant spending many nights just staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd ever truly feel normal again. I needed the time to process everything. Jenny, meantime, was going about her life. It has been a while since I spoke to her, and to tell the truth, I didn't think I would. I assumed she was attending college or something like. Being my parents' favorite child, I'm sure I still am. I had stopped hating her. I believe that as soon as I left the house, my hatred for her vanished. The fact that our parents had held her in such high regard wasn't really her fault. I believe that because I had been blaming her for so long, I was blind to the true severity of the problem. She was merely acting out the part they assigned her. I nearly picked up the phone one night, maybe 6 or 7 months after I left. My dad had written a lengthy email expressing their desire to simply communicate and how much they missed me. I briefly considered responding. I considered offering them an opportunity to clarify, perhaps even make amends. But then I thought back to all the years I had spent being second best. Every time they dismissed me or disregarded me, I was unable to cope. I chose to erase the email instead. I wasn't ready to forget or forgive at that point. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it at all. If they could make up for everything, what would they say? What on earth could they give me now, following all those years of treating me as though I didn't exist? So I continued to be silent. That was the superior option. I owed them nothing, and I wasn't prepared to face them. Not quite yet. I began to feel a little more at ease in my new life as the months passed. While I wasn't precisely joyful, I also wasn't miserable. That's progress, I suppose. I completed my shifts, met some new acquaintances, and my breathing began to return. I made some progress toward creating something for myself over time, even though it was only modest. For once, it felt fantastic to be in charge of my own life, yet occasionally I would think about them. My parents, Jenny, the life I departed from. I questioned what they were doing and whether they had come to terms with how much of a mess they had made. I questioned whether they were merely attempting to absolve themselves or if they really missed me as much as they said. It was difficult to determine. I was aware that I was not prepared to return, not quite yet. It would take some time for me to finish the healing I needed to undertake. Possibly quite a while. The silence was just what I needed for the moment. So let's go back to when I left home almost 2 years ago. I was pretty much used to my new existence by then. It was anything but glitzy. I was still living alone in that small apartment, working at the grocery shop and maintaining my private life. Not many and not too close friends had been made. For the most part, I just kept my head down and worked hard to create something, anything that felt authentically my Dot. Then one day, completely out of the blue, I know I promised not to use that expression, this really appeared out of nowhere. My father sent me a message on Facebook. I nearly didn't even open it. Initially, all I wanted to do was erase everything and carry on with my life. But I had to stop for something. Perhaps I was just interested, Dot. Perhaps all I wanted to do was listen to him. I then gave it a click. That message was lengthy. One of those where it's obvious a lot of thought went into it. My father expressed his sincere regret for the way they had treated me. He acknowledged how unfair it had been to me and that they had favored Jenny Dot. He went on to say that after speaking with my mother, they both understood how much they had messed up. He expressed their desire for a fresh start and an opportunity to mend our connection. He wanted to speak with me in person, so he asked if I would come over for dinner at some point. Here's the problem, though. All I ever wanted for years was an apology. I waited for them to understand how much they hurt me and how invisible they made me feel for a very long time. However, it didn't seem like a massive weight was lifted off my shoulders when I finally understood. It didn't feel like the momentous occasion I had imagined. To be honest, it felt strange. I sat there gazing at the screen, attempting to decipher the emotion I was meant to experience. Do I have to be content, feeling relieved, furious? I had my doubts. It wasn't as easy as, yeah, they apologized, I just knew it. So now everything is all right. Not at all. A part of me wanted to tell them precisely how deeply they had hurt me and respond to them immediately, how the making of things right was not going to be so simple. However, there was a part of me that didn't want to even try, having built my own life without them for 2 years. I wasn't sure if I was ready to welcome them back. Notwithstanding their apology, I discussed it with my therapist at our upcoming appointment. I spelled everything out. Everything. The apology, the message, etc. Something she said to me has truly stuck with me. You don't have to accept their apology merely because they apologized, she said. It is up to you to decide what comes next. It concerns what you require, not concerning their desires. That really got to me. I came to the realization that I didn't have to jump into anything, and that I didn't have to give them my pardon just because they asked. Still, coming up with a plan wasn't simple. The following few days were spent oscillating inside my thoughts. Do I have to respond? Must I disregard it? If I give them one more chance, what might happen? What specifics are actually different? Or would it be the same old tale, with me getting the leftovers and them favoring Jenny? After everything that had happened, I attempted to picture what it would be like to be seated across from my parents at the dinner table. What on earth would we discuss? Would they attempt to defend their behavior, or would they simply ignore it as they always did? I wasn't sure whether I could handle all that. I couldn't help but consider the possibility of obtaining some closure at the same moment. Perhaps at last I could obtain some answers, or at least have a voice. Thus, after giving it a lot of thought, possibly too much, I chose to reply. I didn't write too much. I informed my dad that while I appreciated his apology, I needed more than simply an invitation to dinner if we were going to be in a relationship. I required accurate responses. I wasn't willing to meet up with them until they were prepared to have that open discussion because I needed to know why they had treated me the way they had. After clicking send, I waited. I had no idea what to anticipate. Would they reply immediately? Would I be disregarded by them? I was completely ignorant. However, my dad responded to me the following day. He expressed his understanding and their willingness to be transparent about everything. He assured me that they would respond to any queries I had, no matter how challenging. I recognized then that I was facing a decision. This was my opportunity to address them and get the truth about why things had been the way they had been for the longest time. However, I remained uncertain about my readiness for it. A part of me was afraid to find out what they would say. I was afraid I wouldn't get the satisfaction I believed I deserved. What if something they said exacerbated the situation? What if my perception of the reality was incorrect? I couldn't stop flipping through my thoughts. Was that really the right talk to have at this moment? Considering everything that had transpired, was I still strong enough to confront them? I didn't want to take a chance on reversing all of the hard work I had put into creating my own life, only out of curiosity to hear what they had to say. On the other hand, I also realized that this would continue to eat at me if I didn't address it right now. I so came to a choice following several more therapy sessions and extensive introspection. I agreed to join my dad for supper, but only if they would really take the time to respond to my inquiries. Give up making excuses. Put an end to your pretending. I was determined to get the truth and would not accept anything less. I had this strange feeling on the day I sent the message, a mixture of anxiety and relief. I realized that there was no going back now. I was going to have to take whatever came next head on. I knew I had to do this for myself, not for them, even though I had no idea how it would turn out. I waited as a result. Not as often as in previous years. I was going to see my parents once more. I had no idea what was going to take place. However, one thing was evident. In one way or another, this was going to be a pivotal moment. Thus, after giving it some thought, I consented to see my parents. I was looking forward to our dinner date that we had scheduled. Similar to the type of dread that gnaws at you from the pit of your stomach. I was running over many situations in my head. What they would say, how I would respond, and if I would lose it or remain composed. I knew I had to do it for myself, not for them, even though I had no idea what would happen. When that day arrived, I nearly gave up. Something stopped me as I was holding my phone with my thumb hovering over the cancel button. Perhaps it was that persistent voice in the back of my mind telling me why I needed this and not canceling. After getting into my car and driving to their house, I parked outside and sat there attempting to breathe for a solid 10 minutes. It was strange to be back there. Nothing about the place had changed. Same front yard, same porch, even the very same antique rocker that my father once sat on. What the devil am I doing? I wondered as I sat there. But I knew I would never get in if I didn't go in immediately. I got out of the car and went to the front door, where I rang the bell. Anxiety was starting to surface, and my heart was racing. My parents were standing there as the door opened, and they were older than I had remembered. My dad moved aside to let me in, and my mom smiled. Sort of a hesitant smile. Entering that house was like entering a time warp. Everything had the same appearance. The wall still held the family portraits, the most of which featured Jenny. Naturally, as if I had never left. And that truly confused me for a moment. It opened my eyes to the extent of my own transformation. We sat down at the same dining table where I'd felt invisible for so many dinners, even if they hadn't. When I was a child, spaghetti was my mom's cooking, but I never liked the fragrance. It felt as like they were making an excessive effort to make it appear natural, as if I were simply dropping over for a laid-back family meal. However, we were all aware that wasn't true. At first, I kept quiet. My father struck up a conversation, inquiring about my life, my job, and other such topics. However, I wasn't present for it. I refused to act as though nothing was wrong, so I simply came out with it after a couple of minutes. See, I'm not here to strike up a conversation. I came in search of answers. The room fell quickly silent. My father agreed while giving me a somewhat shocked look. "That is what we owe you," he stated. "You're accurate. I wasted no time at all. I just posed the query that had been bothering me for a long time. Why? Why did you always act as though I didn't exist? Why did Jenny always have the upper hand?" My mother's expression darkened and she began to cry. She gave my dad a confused expression as if she didn't know how to start. After clearing his throat, my dad began to speak. He claimed that they weren't ready for twins when they had Jenny and me. They were terrified when they realized there were two of us because they only wanted one child. He said they just didn't know how to deal with it, so they concentrated on the one that appeared simpler, Jenny. In shock, I sat there. Simpler. You handled me as though I were a problem of some kind. Since I wasn't as attractive or gregarious as Jenny, my father's family. That wasn't how it was. Okay, so perhaps it was. Though it wasn't our intention, we gradually developed the habit of paying Jenny more attention. We were unaware of how much we were ignoring you since she was constantly the center of attention. I was at a loss for words. Though I had expected it to be something along those lines, hearing him say it aloud hurt in a level I wasn't prepared for. At last, my mother said something. At this point, she was crying. Her tone was tremulous. We were in error. We were very mistaken. And only after you had left did we notice it. We believed you to be well. You were so self-reliant from the beginning. Jenny, well, she was in greater need of us. I couldn't contain my laughter. I needed you more, even though there was nothing funny about this. You're saying that because I didn't ask for as much, I didn't need my own parents? Since you didn't have to pamper me the way you treated her? My dad put his head in his hands and my mom just started crying even harder. He said, "We let you down. We apologize. We now notice that. We sincerely apologize." I sat there with all of my hurt and rage welling up inside of me. I was tired, but I also wanted to scream and yell at them for everything that they had done. I wasn't sure if screamed at them would help ease the burden I'd been carrying for so long. I inhaled deeply. I added, "It's not just about saying sorry. It's about realizing how much harm you caused. I've lived my entire life with you, making me feel inadequate, like I was unimportant. Do you wish to apologize now?" They went a long time without saying anything after all these years. My mother simply sobbed. My dad appeared to be clueless on how to resolve the issue, since he really couldn't. I apologized, but it would never be able to erase the years of feeling invisible. Still, I persisted. This isn't where I came to apologize. I had to get this said out loud, which is why I came. You wounded me. You gave me the impression that Jenny was superior to me. Furthermore, you cannot simply take that back. Gradually, My father nodded. I recognize. We don't count on your immediate forgiveness. We merely wanted the opportunity to apologize to you and see if there was anything we could do to put things right. I was unsure if there was a solution. I'm not ready to forgive you, I told them. Though I'm not sure if I ever will be, I'm grateful that you're finally admitting it. After that, there wasn't much more to say. Eating our spaghetti, we sat there in awkward silence for a bit. I didn't leave with the impression that everything had been resolved, nor was it some kind of huge emotional reconciliation. Not at all. However, I had at least said my piece. At least now they were aware of how deeply they had wounded me. I stood up to go after supper. On the way out, my mom gave me a tight hug as if neither of us knew quite what to do. When I was ready to reach out, my dad told me, giving me a pat on the back. I gave a nod, but I said nothing. Leaving, I felt lighter in the car. Not better, I suppose, but lighter. Though it wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, it was still something. It was an initial step. I wasn't sure how I felt after that dinner. I was in this strange kind of mood when I drove back to my flat. Nothing like a massive weight being lifted or anything of the sort happened. It felt more like I had embarked on a very arduous and difficult adventure. Not only did I not feel better, but I also did not feel worse. Simply put, distinctive. I couldn't stop playing the discussion I had with my parents in my thoughts for the following few days. I'm not sure why, but I couldn't stop examining every statement and response. The apology from my dad. My mother sobbing as I told them how hurt I was and how they both simply sat there. I'm not sure what I was anticipating, but I suppose a part of me believed it would be more fulfilling. Like after feeling like I didn't matter and being disregarded for years. This was meant to be the turning point where I at last found some closure. But it never came. It felt so anticlimactic, in fact. They expressed regret. It didn't really change anything, but I got to say what I needed to. It wasn't like our relationship miraculously worked itself out, or that I felt instantly better. If anything, it only served to support my presumption that there was significant damage and that it would be difficult to repair. I couldn't stop thinking about my therapist's statement that I wasn't responsible for their forgiveness, simply because they expressed regret. Every time I felt bad for not being ready to forgive them, I made an effort to remind myself of that. Sure, they wanted things fixed, but it didn't mean I had to prepare for that at this particular moment. Even if they truly apologized, I wasn't sure I wanted to let them back in because I had spent so much time creating a life without them. A couple of days after the dinner, Jenny contacted me. That added an additional level of embarrassment. After telling me about the dinner, she wrote me a lengthy text message expressing her wish that we may speak at a later time. I had no idea how to react to that. Even though she wasn't completely aware of it at the time, she played a role in the reason I left in the first place. It was difficult to divorce the person she was from our parents' treatment of us. I delayed responding. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be honest. I had not even finished dealing with the first can of worms when it felt like opening another one. However, a part of me anticipated having to deal with that as well eventually. I'm just taking each day as it comes right now. I have not yet made any significant decisions. I'm not sure if I want to date Jenny or if I'm ready to let my parents back into my life in their entirety. I quote, am just trying to take everything in at the moment and figure out where I am and what I need. It's peculiar. Receiving the apology feels more like the start of something new than the conclusion of something as I had anticipated. Something that will require a great deal of time to solve. That's all right, too. It has dawned on me that there is no hurry. Whatever follows. I'll do it when I'm prepared. Right now, my only concern is myself. Story 2. My wife cheated and my own mom defended her, so I cut them off and walked away. I'm 49 now, and looking back, everything kind of started falling apart about 10 years ago. At the time, I was married to my wife Karen, and we had 2 kids, my daughter Sarah, who was 12, and my son Mike, who was 9. We were living in Texas, where we had a pretty decent life. We even had a small family business that we ran for years. But then the economy tanked and, well, everything went downhill from there. See, back then there was this huge financial mess called the Great Recession. It was everywhere on the news, and people were losing their jobs, houses, everything. Our business didn't survive either. And honestly, I felt like I was sinking. I was trying to keep things together, but no matter what I did, it seemed like I couldn't catch a break. Our savings were getting eaten up, and there were times when I didn't know how we were going to pay the bills. I remember feeling the pressure on my shoulders every single day, and I knew I had to do something different if we were going to make it. So when I got offered a job overseas in Dubai, I jumped at it. It wasn't an easy decision. In fact, it was probably the hardest one I ever made. But it was a big opportunity and we needed the money. I remember sitting down with Karen and telling her about the offer. I told her it was the only way to get us back on our feet, and she seemed to understand. But there was this look in her eyes like she wasn't entirely convinced. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just worried about the move and being apart. Anyway, I packed my bags and headed to Dubai, promising Karen and the kids that I'd visit home every 6 months. The plan was to set up shop there, earn enough money, and eventually move back once things were more stable. I wasn't happy about leaving, but I kept telling myself that it was for them that I was doing the right thing. You know, trying to be the good husband and dad, taking care of the family, all that. The first few months were tough. Dubai was a whole new world, different culture, different everything, but I threw myself into the work. I worked long hours, built connections, and slowly things started picking up. It was lonely, though. I mean, it's one thing to be busy all day, but coming home to an empty apartment night after night gets to you. I miss my family like crazy. And the only thing that kept me going was the thought that one day I'd be back home with them. I kept my promise and flew back every 6 months. I tried to squeeze in as much time with the kids and Karen as I could, but it wasn't the same. Sarah and Mike were growing up, and I felt like I was missing out on their lives. Karen, well, she seemed distant. At first, I thought it was just because she was stressed from handling everything alone, managing the house, the kids, and everything else. I mean, it's a lot for one person, so I didn't push her on it. I figured she needed time to adjust, just like I did. But every time I came back, it felt like there was this wall between us. I'd suggest that maybe they could move to Dubai with me now that things were going well. And I had a place set up, but Karen wasn't interested. She kept saying the kids were doing well in school and that she didn't want to pull them away from their friends. I got it. Nobody wants to uproot their kids, but a part of me wondered if there was more to it. Still, I let it slide. I didn't want to cause any more stress, especially with everything we'd already been through. When the kids finally finished high school and started college in Houston. I brought it up again. I figured it was the perfect time for Karen to join me. The kids were grown and they had their own lives now, so why not? But again, she shot down the idea. This time she said she didn't want to leave her mom alone, that it would be too much for her to handle. I suggested that we could bring her mom with us to Dubai. Make it a fresh start for all of us, but she just wasn't interested. At this point, I started to feel something wasn't right. I mean, I'd done everything I could. I built a life for us out there, and I was ready to have my family back. but she seemed like she didn't want to be with me at all. I kept trying to convince myself that she just needed more time, that maybe she was scared of the change, but deep down, it didn't sit well. I remember the last visit I made before everything started to really go south. I had this big plan, this idea that I was going to shut down the business in Dubai and move back to Texas for good. I thought it was the answer to all our problems. I mean, if the issue was distance, then the solution was simple, right? Just close up shop. Head home and everything would be fine. I thought she'd be happy, relieved even. But when I told her, she didn't react the way I expected. She seemed irritated, almost like she was annoyed with me, Dot. She said, "Why would you do that? You've worked so hard to set everything up there, and now you just want to throw it all away." I was confused. I thought she'd be excited for me to come back, for us to finally be together as a family again, but instead it felt like she didn't even want me there. That's when I started feeling this knot in my stomach, Dot. Like maybe I was missing something. It wasn't just her reaction that threw me off. A day later, my mom called me up, telling me the exact same thing, telling me not to rush back and that I was making a mistake by closing the business. Now, I hadn't mentioned my plans to anyone but Karen, so I knew she must have talked to my mom about it. I tried not to read into it too much, but it felt like they were plotting something together. It made me doubt my decision and everything else. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe I was just looking for answers that weren't there. After that, I decided to drop the idea of moving back, at least for a while. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I quote, "go days" without calling, just to see if Karen would reach out, but she didn't. Our conversations became quick and to the point, almost like we were just checking off a box. I'd ask about the kids. She'd tell me they were fine, and that was it. It felt like we were strangers, living separate lives. I tried bringing it up a few times, asking if she was happy or if she felt like something was wrong between us, but she'd always brush it off. She quote, say, I was overthinking and that everything was fine, but it didn't feel fine. I kept telling myself I was just stressed out from work, that the distance was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something was changing. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. So after that last visit, things really started to change between Karen and me. It quote S. Like all those small doubts I had were suddenly getting bigger and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I mean, I'd come back home expecting things to feel normal, but they didn't. It felt like I was some stranger dropping by instead of a husband coming home to his wife. Every time I left, I'd hoped that the next trip would be different. But it never was. Karen, and I started talking less and less. It was weird and honestly a bit painful. I'd send a text and sometimes it'd take her hours, even days to respond. When we did talk, it was all just surface-level stuff. She'd tell me about how the kids were doing or how her mom was, but she never really talked about herself. And when I asked, she'd just brush it off like her life didn't matter. Everything's fine, she'd say. But it didn't feel fine. It felt like she was keeping me at arm's length, and I didn't know why. I started testing things. I'd go a whole day without messaging her just to see if she'd notice or ask what was going on. But most of the time, she didn't even seem to care. Days turned into weeks where our communication was barely anything beyond a quick, "How's it going?" or "Kids are fine." I could feel the distance between us getting wider, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd just tell me I was being paranoid. She'd say I was overthinking everything and that we were fine, but I didn't believe it. One time, I asked her straight up if she still wanted to be with me. It was one of those late-night calls when you just can't hold it in anymore. I was tired of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. But instead of reassuring me, she got defensive. She said, "Why would you even ask that? Of course I want to be with you, But the way she said, it felt like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Then there was this one weird thing that really got to me. Karen started becoming super protective of her phone. Now before, she was never like that. She'd leave her phone lying around and it was no big deal. But lately, she wouldn't even let it out of her sight. Even when we were on video calls, if her phone went off, she'd make some excuse and turn off the camera, or say she had to go. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't help but feel like she was hiding something. There was this one time when I came back for a short visit. I was only home for a week, and I noticed she'd always keep her phone face down or take it with her, even if she just left the room for a minute. It was little stuff, but it added up. I tried to play it off, thinking maybe she was just being more careful, but it didn't sit right with me. When I asked her why she was acting weird with her phone, she just laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid again. "You've been gone so long, you're starting to imagine things," she joked. But it didn't feel like a joke. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. It's not like I wanted to think that way about her. I'd trusted Karen for years and we'd been through a lot together. But everything was adding up, and it was hard to ignore. I mean, we'd spent over a decade married, and I thought I knew her better than anyone, but now I wasn't so sure. What really got to me was how distant she was becoming, not just emotionally, but physically. I tried to get close to her during that visit, hug her, kiss her, but she felt cold, like she'd go through the motions, but it was like she was holding back. At one point, I even asked her if something was wrong, but she just shrugged me off. I quote, "Am just stressed," she said. "There's a lot going on with the kids, and your mom's not doing great." She always had an excuse. It felt like she was putting up walls, and no matter how hard I tried to break them down, she wouldn't let me in. It made me start questioning everything. Was it me? Was it the distance, or was there something else going on? Around that same time, my mom started acting weird too. She'd call me up out of nowhere, asking how things were going and giving me advice I didn't ask for. She told me I needed to focus on my business in Dubai and not worry so much about what was happening back home. Now, I love my mom, but it felt like she was reading from Karen's script. It was almost like they were in on something together. I know that sounds paranoid, but when your gut's telling you something's off, it's hard to ignore. One night, after a long day of work in Dubai, I was sitting alone in my apartment thinking about everything. I was feeling really torn. On one hand, I wanted to believe that Karen and my mom were just worried about me and trying to help on the other. It felt like they were pushing me away and I didn't know why. I even started to wonder if Karen had found someone else. I mean, why else would she act so distant? But then I'd feel guilty for thinking that way. She was my wife. If I couldn't trust her, then who could I trust? Still, the doubt was eating at me. I started paying more attention to everything she said, every little detail, trying to find clues that would prove or disprove what I was feeling. But she was careful too. Careful, if you ask me. And every time I brought up my concerns, she'd just brush them off or change the subject. There was this one moment that really stuck with me. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while she was in the kitchen. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up right away. But instead of reading the message, she looked up at me. It was like she was checking to see if I noticed. When she realized I was watching, she quickly put her phone away and went back to cooking. I remember feeling this knot in my stomach like something wasn't right. I asked her later who it was, and she just said it was her mom. But the way she avoided my eyes when she said it made me feel like she was lying. The distance between us kept growing. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the one messing things up by being so far away. But then I'd remind myself that I was out here for them, for Karen and the kids. It wasn't like I wanted to be gone. I was just trying to do the best I could to provide for them, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. I started feeling isolated, like I was stuck in some kind of limbo where I couldn't go back, but couldn't move forward either. Every time I thought about packing up and moving back to Texas, I'd hear Karen's voice in my head telling me I was being too hasty. I'd think about my mom's warnings and I'd second-guess myself all over again. It was like I was trapped, not knowing what the right move was. In the end, I decided to stay put in Dubai for a while longer, trying to keep my mind focused on work. But even then, it was like my heart wasn't in it anymore. I'd get up, go through the motions, and come home to an empty apartment every night. And all the while, the doubt kept growing, clawing at the back of my mind, making me wonder if I was missing something right in front of me. I reached a point where I couldn't take it anymore. The doubt, the distance, and the constant feeling that something was wrong. It all got to me. Every day I felt like I was walking around with a weight on my shoulders, and the more I tried to push it away, the heavier it got. I knew something was going on, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just in my head, it didn't feel like that. So I made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening one way or another. I booked a ticket home but didn't tell anyone. Not Karen, not my mom, not even the kids. I figured if I was wrong, then great. But if I was right, at least I'd know for sure. And honestly, the not knowing was worse than anything else. When I landed in Texas, I was anxious. My mind was racing, and I kept thinking about all the possibilities, everything I might find. I got to the house early in the morning, using the spare key to let myself in. The place was quiet, and for a second I thought maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe Karen had just been tired or stressed and I'd been blowing things out of proportion. But then, as I walked through the house, I noticed small things that felt off. There were things out of place, like Karen's clothes folded neatly on the couch instead of in the bedroom, and her phone charger left plugged into the kitchen wall when she always kept it by the bed. It was small stuff, but enough to make my nerves spike. I kept telling myself to calm down, but every step I took felt like I was getting closer to something I wasn't ready to face. Then I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. I turned the corner and saw Karen standing there, looking completely shocked to see me. Her reaction was everything I needed to know. She froze for a moment, and then she forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you're home early," she said, trying to play it off like she was happy to see me. But I could tell she wasn't. I kept it casual. I told her I had a light workload for the month and thought it'd be a nice surprise to come home and spend some time together. She went along with it, but the whole time I could see how tense she was. She was asking questions, almost too many, about why I didn't tell her I was coming and how long I planned to stay. It was like she was trying to figure out how much time she had to prepare or hide something. I shrugged it off, but inside I knew she was hiding something. Over the next couple of days, I paid close attention to everything. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't suspicious, but I watched every move she made. I noticed she was still being weird with her phone, always keeping it close, always checking it when she thought I wasn't looking. It was almost like she was waiting for a message or trying to hide who she was talking to. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I started snooping when she was asleep or in the shower. I'd check her phone, but she had it locked up tight. No messages, no missed calls, nothing out of the ordinary. It was like she had wiped everything clean. I felt like an idiot, but it just made me more determined to get to the bottom of it. One night, while she was out running errands, I decided to take things a step further. I put a GPS tracker in her car. I know it's extreme, and it's not something I'm proud of, but I needed answers. I couldn't live with the constant doubt anymore, and if she was up to something, I wanted to know for sure. The first couple of times I tracked her, everything seemed normal. She go to the grocery store, visit her mom's place, or pick up some stuff from the pharmacy. But then one day, I saw her go to this small hardware store across town. It was a place I'd never heard her mention before, and I'd never seen her go there during my visits. I waited, thinking maybe she was just grabbing some supplies or whatever, but she stayed there for a long time. I drove over, parked a few blocks away, and watched from a distance. The place looked closed, lights off and everything, but Karen's car was parked out front. After a while, the store owner came out and looked around, almost like he was checking if anyone was watching. Then he pulled down the shutters with Karen still inside. My heart sank. I knew right then that I was on to something, but I needed more proof. I followed her again a few days later, same routine. She went to the hardware store and the owner shut the place down as soon as she walked in. This time I stayed longer, waiting to see if anything would happen. I felt this anger bubbling up inside me, but I had to keep my cool. If I went in guns blazing without any solid proof, she'd just lie or come up with some excuse. A couple of days later, I decided to test the waters. I casually asked Karen about the store, pretending like I saw it while driving past. She hesitated for a second, but then said she was helping out with some home improvement project for her mom. She said it so smoothly I almost believed her, but something in her eyes gave her away. It was like she was waiting to see if I'd buy her story. I just nodded and played along, but I knew she was lying. The next time I tracked her, I parked even closer. I watched as she got out of her car and met the store owner outside. They talked for a bit, and then I saw him put his arm around her. It wasn't just a friendly gesture the way he pulled her close. It was like they were more than friends. My blood was boiling. I wanted to confront them right then and there, but I forced myself to wait. After they went inside and he pulled the shutters down again, I got out of my car and walked up to the store. I knocked on the door a few times, but there was no answer. I could hear movement inside like they were scrambling. It took everything in me not to kick the door down, but I knew I had to play this smart. If I blew my cover now, I'd never get the truth. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and walked away, feeling more conflicted than ever. Part of me wanted to keep digging to find out everything. But another part of me didn't want to know. I didn't want to face the reality that Karen, the woman I'd trusted for so long, was betraying me. But I had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting my worst fears. Over the next few days, I kept a closer eye on her. She had this routine going out in the afternoons, sometimes visiting her mom, other times running errands. Every time she left, I followed. It was exhausting, but I needed to catch her slipping up. I needed that one piece of undeniable proof. It was like waiting for a storm to hit. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know when or how bad it would be. I just had to be ready. After everything I'd seen and all the doubts swirling in my head, I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch anymore. It was eating me up inside. All those times I'd convinced myself to stay calm, to play it smart. Felt like they were only giving Karen more chances to cover her tracks. I had to do something, and I had to do it soon. So I made a plan to catch her in the act. And this time there was no turning back. I kept tracking her movements for the next few days, trying to find a pattern. She had this habit of going out in the afternoon, saying she was visiting her mom or running errands. But I knew better. Now. I just needed to be ready for the right moment. Then one day, everything lined up. She left the house and her car's tracker led me straight to that same hardware store. I parked my car a block away, far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to keep an eye on the place. My heart was pounding as I watched her pull up, get out, and walk toward the store. The guy came out to greet her and they exchanged a quick look before heading inside. Just like before, he pulled the shutters down, closing up shop with Karen still in there. This was it. I knew this was my chance. I got out of the car and walked up to the store, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and adrenaline. When I reached the door, I knocked hard. At first, there was no response, just silence. I banged again, louder this time, and finally the guy opened the door. Crack. He looked surprised to see me, like he wasn't expecting any visitors, let alone me. "Where's Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the rage boiling up inside me. The guy hesitated, his eyes shifting like he was looking for a way out. He didn't say anything, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I pushed the door open and walked in, not giving him a chance to stop me. The store was dimly lit, and most of the shelves were covered with tarps, like the place wasn't even in business. I moved quickly through the aisles, following the sounds coming from the back. My heart was racing, and every step felt heavier than the last. Then I found her. Karen was there in the storeroom, in a position I wish I could unsee. She looked up, and the shock on her face was everything I needed to know. She'd been caught. The moment froze for a second, everything crashing down on me at once. All the suspicion, all the doubt, it all became real. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there it was, right in front of me. The guy, her so-called friend, or whatever he was, tried to step in between us, but I wasn't having it. I lunged at him, shoving him out of the way, and yelled at Karen, demanding to know how long this had been going on. She was scrambling, pulling herself together, and for a moment she just stared at me, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. She tried to say something, but her voice was shaky. The guy jumped back in, grabbing me by the arm, and things got heated real fast. We started shoving each other, and he tried to drag me out of the storeroom. Karen was yelling at both of us to stop, but everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. I managed to push him off and got one good punch in, knocking him back. I could feel the anger and betrayal driving every move I made. Karen finally stepped in between us, telling the guy to back off. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to leave, saying we could talk about this later at home. But I wasn't leaving without answers. "Why, Karen?" I demanded. "How long have you been doing this?" I could barely keep my voice steady. The anger was mixing with this awful, sinking feeling of betrayal, and I needed to know why. Karen stood there, wiping her eyes, and finally she started to speak. "It's not what you think," she said, "but I wasn't having any of it." "How long?" I shouted again, and she flinched, finally admitting, "It's been a few years." "Okay, but it doesn't mean anything." "A few years?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was standing there acting like it was no big deal, like this wasn't the complete destruction of our marriage. I couldn't even look at her. I felt my whole body go numb. A few years, I repeated more to myself than to her. All this time, and you just kept lying to me? She tried to explain, saying something about how lonely she'd been and how hard it was with me gone for so long. She said she didn't want to hurt me, but she didn't know how to cope with the distance. It was excuse after excuse, and I just stood there letting the words wash over me. None of it mattered. The fact was, she chose to betray me instead of being honest. I looked at the guy, and he had this smug look on his face, like he thought he'd gotten away with something. You need to leave. I told him, my voice barely above a growl. This is between me and my wife. He hesitated, and I stepped forward, making it clear I wasn't going to let him stay. Finally, he backed off, muttering something under his breath as he left the storeroom. Karen tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. T, I said. Just don't. She started crying again, pleading with me to go home with her so we could talk. But I wasn't in the mood for talking. I felt like my whole world had come crashing down, and there was no going back from this. She kept saying she was sorry, that it wasn't what I thought, but I didn't want to hear it. You had years to tell me the truth. I said you had years to fix this, and instead you chose this guy over our marriage. She didn't know what to say. She just stood there, crying, while I felt everything I'd built with her slip away. All the trust, all the love. It felt like it had been torn to shreds in that moment. I told her I needed space, that I couldn't be around her right now. She tried to protest, but I was done listening. I walked out of that store, not looking back, and drove straight to my mom's house. My head was spinning, and all I could think about was how everything had fallen apart. I needed answers, and if Karen wasn't going to give them to me, then maybe my mom would when I got to her place. I didn't waste any time. I walked in, and the first thing I said was, "You knew, didn't you?" My mom tried to act surprised, but I could see right through it. "Don't lie to me." I told her you knew about Karen's affair. She just sat there looking guilty. And that was all the confirmation I needed. She started to cry, saying she didn't want to tell me because she thought it would destroy everything. "You think this doesn't hurt?" I shot back, keeping it from me, pretending everything was fine. How is that any better? My mom reached for my hand, telling me she was sorry, but I couldn't handle it. I pulled away, feeling like I'd been betrayed all over again. Not just by Karen, but by my own family. I felt like I didn't know who I could trust anymore. I told her I needed to be alone, and before she could say anything else, I walked out. I needed space to process everything, to figure out what I was going to do next. My marriage was falling apart, and my family had lied to me. It felt like everything I thought I knew had been ripped away, and I didn't know where to go from there. After leaving my mom's place, I drove around for hours, not knowing where to go or what to do next. My head was a mess, and everything felt like it was spinning out of control. I mean, how was I supposed to process all of this? My wife had been cheating on me for years, and my own mother had known about it and said nothing. It was like every single thing I believed in had been flipped upside down. I ended up parking by a small park we used to take the kids to when they were little. I sat there staring at nothing, feeling like I was stuck in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Part of me wanted to go back to the house, to confront Karen again, to scream and yell and demand why she had thrown away everything we'd built together. But another part of me felt drained, like I didn't have the energy for it anymore. I was just done. For the next couple of days, I stayed at a cheap motel. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I needed time to think, to figure out what my next move was going to be. Karen was blowing up my phone with calls and texts, begging me to come back so we could talk. But I ignored her. She had her chance to be honest, and she blew it. I wasn't ready to hear any more of her excuses. My mom tried reaching out to leaving voicemails saying she was worried about me and that she was sorry, but every time I listened to her voice, all I could think about was how she'd look me in the eye and lied, pretending everything was fine when she knew the truth. I couldn't get past that. It felt like my own family had betrayed me, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive her for that. On the third day, I decided to pack my bags and head to Houston. My daughters were there, living on their own, and I needed to see them. They were grown now, but they deserved to know what was going on. I didn't want Karen getting to them first and twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. I'd seen enough of that already, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate our kids. When I got to Houston, I met up with them at a coffee shop. They were happy to see me at first, but then they saw the look on my face, and I could tell they knew something was wrong. We sat down and I told them everything. The affair, how long it had been going on, and how my mom had known the whole time. I watched their faces change as the reality of it hit them. My oldest daughter, Sarah, was angry. She said she always had this weird feeling about her mom that sometimes things didn't add up. She even mentioned seeing Karen act a little too friendly with some guy when she'd visited home once, but she brushed it off, thinking it was nothing. Now it all made sense to her. My younger one, Mike, was quieter. He seemed hurt and confused, like he didn't know how to process at all. I could tell he was trying to stay strong, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He'd always been closer to Karen, and I knew this was going to hit him harder. I felt awful seeing my kids go through this, knowing that the family they thought they had wasn't real. It felt like I'd failed them somehow. Like I should have seen the signs sooner. Sarah said she was done with her mom. She didn't want to hear any excuses and told me she'd already blocked Karen's number. She was furious, and honestly, I didn't blame her. But Mike, he was more torn. He didn't want to cut off his mom even after everything. I told him it was his choice. I wasn't going to force him to take sides, but I reminded him to be careful. I knew Karen, and I knew she'd try to twist things to get him on her side. After I talked to the kids, I drove back to the house. I figured it was time to face Karen again and deal with whatever came next. I needed to figure out where we were headed and what the future looked like, now that everything was out in the open. When I walked in, Karen was waiting for me sitting at the kitchen table. She looked like a mess. Red eyes, tissues everywhere. But I wasn't feeling sorry for her. She got up when she saw me and tried to hug me, but I stepped back. "We need to talk," I said, and she nodded, sitting back down. We sat there for what felt like ages, just staring at each other. Finally, she started talking. She went on about how she felt lonely all those years I was away, how she was struggling, and how she made a mistake. She tried to make it sound like it was just some meaningless thing, like she was doing it to fill the void. But I wasn't buying it. You had years to tell me the truth. I said years, and instead you chose to lie. She kept apologizing, saying she never meant to hurt me and that she didn't want to lose me. But the more she talked, the more I realized she was just scared of losing her comfortable life. It wasn't about me. It was about the security and the money. I could see right through her now, and all the trust I used to have in her was gone. I asked her how many people knew about the affair. She hesitated, and that told me everything my mom knew. Right? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She nodded, saying that my mom found out a few years back but promised not to say anything. She said she didn't want to ruin the family. Karen added it felt like a punch to the gut. Hearing that excuse again, it was like they thought keeping me in the dark was doing me a favor. At that point, I was done. I got up, grabbed my things, and told her I was leaving. She tried to follow me, crying and begging me to stay, but I couldn't even look at her anymore. I told her I needed space and that I wasn't coming back until I figured out what I wanted to do next. I wasn't ready to talk about divorce or what would happen to the house. I just needed to get out of there. I drove back to the motel, feeling a mix of anger and relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some control over my life again. I didn't know what the future was going to look like, but at least I was done pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. I decided to cut off Karen financially, if she wanted to stay in that house. She'd have to figure it out herself. I wasn't going to keep supporting her while she lived off my hard work and betrayed me behind my back. I called my daughters and told them what I was planning. Sarah was all for it. She said Karen needed to face the consequences of her actions. Mike was quieter, and I could tell he was struggling with it. I told him that it was his decision if he wanted to help his mom, but that I wasn't going to be part of it anymore. He needed to know the truth and make his own choices. So that's where things stand now. I'm still at the motel trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wants to pack up and go back to Dubai to put as much distance between myself in this mess as possible. But another part of me knows that running away won't solve anything. I need to face it head on, but I'm not sure how yet. For now, I'm just taking things one day at a time, trying to process everything and figure out what's best for me and my kids. I quote keep updating when I can, but honestly, I don't know how this is going to play out. All I know is that I'm done being taken for a fool, and I'm done letting other people decide my life for me. Story 3. I cut them off and left because my wife had cheated on me and my mother had stood up for her. Looking back, I see that everything kind of fell apart 10 years ago. I am now 49 years old. I was married to my wife Karen at the time, and we had 2 children. My son Mike, who was 9 years old, and my daughter Sarah, who was 12. We had a good life in Texas, where we were residing. We even owned and operated a modest family company for many years. However, when the economy collapsed, well, things just got worse. You see, there was a major financial crisis known as the Great Recession back then. People were losing their jobs, homes, and everything else, and it was all over the news. Our company, too, failed to survive. To be honest, I thought I was going to drown. I was making an effort to maintain order, but it felt like I was always getting into trouble. Our finances were rapidly depleting, and there were moments when I was unsure of how we would cover our expenses. Every day I could feel the weight bearing down on my shoulders, and I knew something had to change if we were going to survive. I leaped at the chance to work abroad in Dubai when I received an offer. The choice wasn't made lightly. It was, in fact, most likely the hardest one I have ever produced. But we needed the money, and it was a great opportunity. I recall telling Karen about the opportunity when we sat down. She appeared to understand when I told her it was the only way to get us back on our feet. However, there was a glint in her eyes that suggested she wasn't quite sure. I didn't give it much thought at the moment. I assumed her concerns were limited to the relocation and participation. Nevertheless, I promised Karen and the kids that I would return home every 6 months as I packed my things and flew to Dubai. The idea was to establish a business there, make a sufficient amount of money, and then, when circumstances improved, relocate back. Though I didn't enjoy leaving, I kept reminding myself that I was acting in their best interests, taking care of the family, trying to be a decent husband and father and all that. The initial months were difficult. Dubai was a whole separate planet with a distinct culture. Nevertheless, I gave the assignment my all. I put in a lot of overtime, made friends, and eventually things began to improve. Still, it was lonesome. Being busy all day is one thing, but it becomes old quickly when you return home to an empty flat every night. I terribly miss my family. The idea that I would one day return home with them was the only thing that kept me going. I returned to the United States every 6 months as promised. It wasn't the same, even though I made an effort to spend as much time as possible with Karen and the kids. I was feeling like I was losing out on Sarah and Mike's growing up. Karen, well, she came out as aloof. Initially, I assumed that it was just stress from managing the kids, the house, and everything else by herself. I didn't press her for it since, really, that's a lot for one person. Like me, I believed she needed time to get used to it. However, each time I returned, it seemed as though a wall stood between us. Now that things were going well, perhaps they might relocate to Dubai with me, I would say. Additionally, I had a location ready, but Karen wasn't keen. She reiterated that she didn't want to take the kids away from their friends and that they were doing well in school. I understand. Although no parent likes to move their children, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. I still didn't mind, however. In light of what we had just experienced, I didn't want to add to the tension. When the children at last enrolled at Houston's college after high school, I brought it up once again. I thought this would be the ideal opportunity to have Karen join me. Why not? The children were grown and living on their own. But once more, she rejected the notion. This time, she said that it would be too much for her to bear and that she didn't want to leave her mother alone. I proposed that we travel to Dubai with her mother in tow. Make it a new beginning for all of us, but she showed no interest in it. I began to sense that something wasn't quite right at this point. I had done all that I could, after all. I was eager to see my family again since I had created a life for us out there. However, it appeared that she had no desire to be with me. I kept telling myself that she was only in need of more time. Maybe perhaps she was afraid of the shift. However, it didn't sit right deep inside. I recall my final visit before things really started to go wrong. I had a grand scheme, a notion that I would close the company in Dubai and permanently relocate to Texas. I believed it to be the solution to every issue we faced. Distance was the problem after all, so it must be easy to fix, right? Simply shut down your business. Everything will be well once you go home. I assumed she would feel content, perhaps relieved. She appeared agitated, almost as though she was displeased with me when I informed her that she hadn't responded as I had anticipated. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "After putting so much effort into setting things up, all you want to do is toss it away." I couldn't figure it out. I assumed she would be thrilled to see me again, want us to be together as a family at last. Rather, it seemed as though she didn't even want me to be there. That's when the knot in my gut first appeared, as if I was overlooking something. Her reply wasn't the only thing that confused me. My mother gave me the same advice over the phone a day later, cautioning me against hurrying back and informing me that stopping the firm was a mistake. I realized that Karen must have told my mom about my plans because I hadn't disclosed them to anybody else. It felt like they were conspiring together, but I tried not to read too much into it. It caused me to question everything, even my choice. Perhaps I was just searching for unanswered questions, or perhaps I was acting suspiciously. I then made the decision to give up on the notion of going back, at least temporarily, but I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sensation I had. I would wait days for a call, hoping Karen would get in touch, but she never did. Our talks sped up and grew more focused, as if we were merely crossing things off a list. "How are the kids doing?" She would assure me that was all and that they were okay. We seemed to be strangers leading different lives. I made many attempts to bring it up, asking her whether she was content or if she thought there was a problem between us, but she would always ignore me. Even though I felt like I was overanalyzing everything, she would assure me that everything was well. I kept telling myself that the distance was playing tricks on me and that I was just stressed out from work. But I had a gut feeling that things was shifting. The hardest thing was that I had no idea how to make it better. Thus, following that final visit, Karen and I experienced a significant shift in our relationship. It felt like every little doubt I had was suddenly growing stronger and I was unable to ignore it. Even though I would have expected things to feel normal upon returning home, they didn't. It was more like a stranger stopping by than a husband returning home with his spouse. I'd always hoped that the following trip would be different, but that had never happened. Karen and I began to communicate less and less. It was strange and, to be honest, a little unpleasant. Sometimes she would take hours or even days to respond to my texts. When we did speak, it was just about the simplest topics. She would occasionally brief me on the kids' lives or her mother's health, but she seldom ever discussed herself. And she dismissed my question as if it didn't concern her life. She would say, "Everything's okay." It didn't feel well, though. I had the impression that she was avoiding me, and I wasn't sure why. I got to work testing things. I would try not to message her for a whole day to see if she would notice or inquire as to what was going on. But she didn't even appear to care most of the time. Weeks passed, during which we seldom spoke at all. Our exchanges were brief. "How are things going?" or "The children are doing well." I could feel our gap growing, but if I attempted to talk about it, she would just dismiss it as paranoia. She would tell me we were okay and I was just overanalyzing things, but I didn't buy it. I once questioned her outright whether she still desired our relationship. It was one of those calls you get late at night when you simply can't take it anymore. I had had enough of acting as though nothing was wrong when it was obviously not. But she became defensive rather than reassuring me. "Why would you even ask that?" she said. "I want to be with you, of course. However, it seemed more like she was trying to persuade herself than I was from the way she spoke. And then there was this one strange item that struck a chord with me. Karen started to take extreme measures to secure her phone. She was never that way before, nor is she now. It didn't bother her when she would leave her phone lying around. She wouldn't even allow it out of her sight, though. These days, her phone may go off even when we were on a video conversation. She would switch off the camera and offer some reason that she had to go. Though I wasn't sure what to make of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was concealing something. There was this one occasion when I paid a quick visitation. During my week-long stay at home, I saw that she would consistently carry her phone with her or keep it facing down. Even if she was only gone for a short while. Even if it was small, the things added up. I attempted to downplay it, figuring that perhaps she was simply being extra cautious. However, that didn't set well with me. She shrugged off my question about why she was acting strangely around her phone and said I was being paranoid once more. She laughed. "You've been gone for so long that you're starting to dream things, Dot." However, it didn't seem lighthearted. I couldn't get rid of the notion that something was going on after that. It's not as though I was hoping to feel that way about her. For years, I had put my confidence in Karen, and we had experienced a lot together. However, it was difficult to deny how everything was mounting up. Even though we had been married for more than 10 years, I no longer felt as confident in my knowledge of her. The fact that she was growing more and more aloof really got to me, not just mentally, but also bodily. During that visit, I made an effort to embrace and kiss her. Despite going through the motions, she felt chilled, but she seemed to be holding something back. I even questioned her once if there was a problem, but she just dismissed me. She said, "I'm just stressed. Your mother isn't doing well, and there are a lot of things going on with the kids." She was continuously coming up with an excuse. She seemed to be building walls, and she refused to let me in, no matter how hard I tried to dismantle them. It caused me to begin doubting everything. Was I the one? Was it the distance, or was there another factor at play? My mom also started acting strangely about the same period. She used to randomly phone me to check on me, ask how things were going, and give me unsolicited advice. She advised me not to worry too much about what was going on back home and to concentrate on running my business in Dubai. Though I adore my mother, it seemed as though she was reciting a screenplay written by Karen. They appeared to be working together on something. That may sound overly cautious, but it's difficult to ignore your intuition when it tells you something is wrong. After a tough workday in Dubai, I spent a lonely evening at my apartment, reflecting on everything. I felt quite conflicted. I wanted to think that my mom and Karen were just concerned about me and making an effort to support me. I couldn't figure out why it seemed like they were pushing me away. I began to question whether Karen had moved on to someone else. Why else would she behave as aloof as she did, really? I would then feel bad about thinking that way. She was my spouse. Who could I trust if I couldn't even trust her? It was still gnawing at me, this doubt. I began to listen to everything she said more intently. I looked at every minute detail, searching for hints that might confirm or refute my feelings. She was cautious, though. Be cautious, in my opinion. And each time I voiced my worries, she would just ignore them or divert the conversation. There was one particular instance that truly resonated with me. She was in the kitchen, and I was looking through my phone while seated on the couch. When her phone buzzed, she quickly answered it. Nevertheless, she glanced up at me rather than reading the message. It seemed as though she was trying to see if I would notice. She put her phone aside as soon as she knew I was observing and returned to her cooking. I recall having a knot in my gut, like though something wasn't quite right. When I subsequently asked her who it was, she just replied that it was her mother. However, I felt that she was lying because of the way she sidestepped my gaze when she stated it. The gap between us continued to widen. Lying in bed, I would gaze up at the ceiling, questioning whether my distance was causing problems or not. I would then tell myself that I was here for them, nevertheless, for Karen and the children. It wasn't as though I desired to go. All I was trying to do was provide them the finest care possible. However, it didn't seem to matter anymore. I began to feel alone, as though I was in a state of non-existence, unable to move ahead or go back. Karen,"'s voice would always be in my brain when I considered packed up and returning to Texas. She would always tell me that I was moving too quickly. I would reevaluate my actions after considering my mother's advice. I felt as though I was stuck and had no idea what to do. Ultimately, I made the decision to remain in Dubai for a little bit longer in an effort to maintain my work-focused mindset. Even so, though, it felt as though my heart was no longer in it. Every night I would get up, go through the motions, and return home to an empty apartment. And during it all, I couldn't help but feel doubt creep in and start to question whether I was overlooking something that was clearly there in front of me. There came a time when I was at my breaking point. The uncertainty, the separation, and the persistent sense that something was off. Everything affected me. I felt like I had a burden on my shoulders every day while I went about my business. Furthermore, it grew heavier the harder I attempted to shove it away. Despite my best efforts to tell myself that it was all in my imagination, I could sense that something more was happening. I therefore came to a choice. One way or another, I was going to find out what was going on. I purchased a ticket home without telling anyone. Not my mother, not Karen, not even the children. If I was mistaken, that was excellent, I reasoned. If I was mistaken, though, at least I would know for sure. To be honest, the ignorance was more detrimental than anything else. Upon my arrival in Texas, I was nervous. I could not stop thinking about all the possibilities since my mind was racing, everything I could possibly discover. I used the extra key to allow myself in when I arrived at the residence early in the morning. It was silent there, and for a moment I wondered whether I had overreacted. Perhaps I had been exaggerating things and Karen had simply been worn out or under stress. However, as I moved through the house, I became aware of a few little oddities. Things were not where they should have been, such as Karen's clothing, which were folded neatly on the couch rather than in the bedroom, and her phone charger, which she always kept beside the bed, plugged into the kitchen outlet. Even though it was little, it was enough to set my nerves on edge. Every step I took seemed like I was getting closer to something I wasn't ready to confront, even though I kept urging myself to calm down. Then footsteps could be heard from the kitchen. As I rounded the corner, Karen was standing there staring at me with utter disbelief. Her response told me all I needed to know. She hesitated for a second, then contrived a grin that fell short of her eyes. "You arrive home early, I see." I could see she wasn't delighted to see me, despite her attempts to play it off. I spoke informally. I felt it would be a pleasant surprise to return home and spend some time with her, so I told her I had a light workload for the month. She agreed to it, but I could tell how uncomfortable she was the entire time. She was inquiring about why I hadn't told her I was coming and how long I intended to stay. Almost too many inquiries. It seemed as though she was attempting to calculate how much time she had left to get ready or conceal anything. I dismissed it, but I felt deep down that she was concealing something. For the following 2 days, I observed everything carefully. I made an effort to appear uninterested and normal, but I was observing everything she did. She was still acting strangely when using her phone, I noted, keeping it near at all times. Whenever she thought I wasn't looking, she was always checking it. It appeared as though she was attempting to conceal who she was speaking to or waiting for a message. I was no longer able to ignore it. I have to be aware of the situation. And so, I took a step that I never would have taken. I began spying on her when she was in the shower or asleep. She had her phone securely secured, so I would check it. Not a single missed call or message, nothing unusual at all. She appeared to have completely cleaned everything. Even though I felt foolish, it strengthened my resolve to find the solution. While she was out doing errands one evening, I made the decision to go a step further. I equipped her automobile with a GPS tracker. I needed answers, even though I realize it's excessive and not something I'm proud of. I wanted to know for sure if she was up to anything because I couldn't bear the incessant doubt any longer. When I originally started tracking her, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. She would see her mother, go to the grocery shop, or get something from the drugstore. However, one day I saw her going across town to this little hardware store. I'd never seen her go there while I visited, and I'd never heard her mention it before. She stayed there for a while, so I waited, figuring maybe she was just getting supplies or something. I parked a few blocks away, drove over, and observed from a distance. With all the lights off, the establishment appeared closed, but Karen's car was parked in front. The proprietor of the business eventually emerged and seemed to be looking around to see whether anyone was observing. Then, while Karen was still inside, he lowered the shutters. My heart fell. Even though I already knew I was onto something, I still required additional evidence. A few days later, I followed her once more. Same pattern. When she arrived at the hardware store, the proprietor closed it. The moment she entered, I waited a little longer this time to see what would happen. I could feel the rage rising within of me, but I had to control myself. She would just lie or make up an explanation if I walked in with all guns blazing and no concrete evidence. After a few days, I made the decision to give it a try. I pretended to have driven by the business and asked Karen inane questions about it. After a brief moment of hesitation, she said that she was assisting her mother with a house renovation project. She spoke with such ease that I nearly bought into it, yet there was a hint of disbelief in her eyes. She seemed to be waiting to see whether I would believe her account. Even though I knew she was lying, I still nodded and followed along. I parked much closer the following time I tried to track her. I saw her step out of her car and head outside to see the owner of the shop, Dot. After a little while of conversation, I watched him put his arm around her. The way he drew her in closer was more than simply a kind gesture. They seemed to be more than just pals. I felt my blood start to boil. I pushed myself to wait, even though I wanted to face them right then and there. I got out of my car and stepped up to the business after they went inside, and he put down the shutters once again. I repeatedly knocked on the door, but nobody answered. It sounded like they were scurrying about inside. It was everything I could do not to kick down the door, but I knew I had to be this cunning. I would never know the truth if I revealed my identity today. Feeling more confused than ever, I took a step back, inhaled deeply, and turned to go Dot. There was a part of me that wanted to keep looking for answers, and a part of me that didn't want to know. Karen was the lady I'd trusted for so long, and I didn't want to confront the truth that she was betraying me. However, even if it meant facing my biggest fears, I had to know the truth. I watched her more intently over the following 3 days. She would go out in the afternoons according to her pattern, sometimes to visit her parents and other times to conduct errands. Whenever she went, I trailed after. Even if it was tiresome, I had to catch her when she slipped up. I required that one indisputable piece of evidence. It was like waiting for a tempest to pass. Although I felt something was about to happen, I had no idea when or how severe it would be. I only needed to prepare. I realized that I could no longer merely observe from a distance after everything I'd witnessed and all the questions circling around in my mind. Inside, it was devouring me. During all those moments, I had persuaded myself to remain composed and use caution. It seems like they were only giving Karen further opportunities to hide her traces. I had to take action, and I had to act quickly, Dot. So I plotted to get her while she was doing it, and there was no going back this time. I followed her about for the following 3 days, attempting to identify any patterns. She had a tendency of leaving the house in the afternoon, claiming to be running errands or seeing her mother. However, I was aware of this. Right now. All I had to do was wait for the appropriate opportunity, until one day everything fell into place. The tracker on her car took me directly to the hardware shop after she departed. I parked my car a block away so I could watch the area from a distance without being observed. Watching her pull up, get out, and head into the store had my heart racing. The man approached her from outside, giving her a brief glance before making his way inside. He drew down the shutters, same as previously. Karen was still there when they closed the store. That was it. This, I realized, was my moment. I exited the vehicle and made my way into the shop. Anger and adrenaline combined to make my hands tremble. I pounded firmly when I got to the door. Initially, there was no reply. Nothing but quiet. After I pounded harder, the man eventually opened the door. Break. He didn't seem to be expecting any guests, much less me, and was shocked to see me. "Karen, where are you?" I asked, attempting to sound calm, but I could feel my anger building up. The man paused, changing his gaze as if he was trying to find an escape. I only needed his silence to affirm what I already knew. Before he could stop me, I pushed the door open and entered. The store's shelves were mostly covered with tarps, and it was poorly lighted, as if it wasn't even a company. I made my way down the aisles fast, paying attention to the noises coming from behind me. My pulse was pounding, and each step I took felt more weighty than the previous. Then I located her. In the storage room, Karen was there, in a position I hope I could turn away from. All I needed to know was the expression of shock on her face when she glanced up. She had been discovered. For a little period, nothing happened. It's all coming down on me at once. All the uncertainty, all the distrust. Everything turned to become reality. I was seeing things that I couldn't believe. However, there it stood, there before me, the man, Buddy, or whatever he was supposed to be. Attempted to stand in our way, but I wouldn't have it. I shouted at Karen, demanding to know how long this had been going on, and lunged at him, forcing him aside. She was struggling to gather herself, and for an instant, she just looked at me with her eyes wide, much like a deer caught in headlights. Her voice was unsteady as she attempted to speak. Things quickly heated up as the guy leaped back in and grabbed me by the arm. He attempted to drag me out of the storeroom as we began to shove each other. Everything seemed to be moving slowly, even though Karen was screaming at us both to stop. I was able to push him away and knock him back with a solid blow. I could feel the betrayal and rage propelling everything I did. At last, Karen intervened and told the man to move away from us. Now she was weeping. She begged me to go, tears running down her cheeks, saying we could discuss things at home later. I was not, however, going away empty-handed. "Karen, why?" I insisted. "When did you start doing this?" I had trouble maintaining a steady voice. I needed to know why I was experiencing this terrible, sinking sense of betrayal mixed with wrath. Karen stood there, dabbing at her eyes, and then at last she began to talk. She said, "It's not what you think." I, however, was not having any of it. For what duration? "It's been a few years," she eventually said as she cringed at my cry once again. "All right, but it's meaningless." The words struck me like a kick to the stomach a few years ago. She pretended it didn't matter as she stood there, as if our marriage hadn't completely fallen apart because of this. Not even that I could look at her. My entire body went numb. I talked to myself more than to her for a few years, during the entire period. "And you just continued to mislead me?" She made an attempt to clarify, mentioning how difficult it was being with me and how lonely she had been. Disappeared for a very long time. She said that although she didn't want to harm me, she was unable to handle the distance. I just remained there, allowing the words to wash over me while explanation after excuse was made. It all didn't matter. The truth was, she could have been honest, but she chose to deceive me. The man had this arrogant expression on his face as I glanced at him, as if he had somehow gotten away with something. "You must go now." With a voice little above a snarl, I told him, "This is only between my spouse and myself." He wavered, and I moved forward to firmly tell him that I would not be allowing him to stay. At last, he withdrew, whispering something behind his back as he exited the supply room. Karen attempted to grasp my hand, but I withdrew. Avoid it. I stated, "Don't, please." She broke down again and begged me to accompany her home so we could have a conversation. However, I wasn't feeling like conversing. It seemed as though everything in my universe had collapsed, and there was no turning back. I didn't want to hear her apologize and tell me it wasn't what I thought. "You have years to be honest with me." "You had years to remedy this," I replied, "and you passed on our marriage in favor of this guy instead." She was at a loss for words. She simply wept as I felt all I had worked so hard to create with her crumble. All the love and all the trust. It seemed as though it had just been ripped to pieces. I informed her that I couldn't be with her at this time and that I needed time alone. She attempted to object, but I had had enough. I drove directly to my mother's house after leaving the store without turning around. All I could think of while my head spun was how everything had come apart. I wanted answers, and maybe my mother could provide them if Karen was unwilling to do so. Once I arrived at her home, I wasted no time at all. "You knew, didn't you?" was the first thing I said as I went in. My mother attempted to appear shocked, but I was able to see straight through it. "Please don't mislead me. You were aware of Karen's affair," I informed her. She sat there looking remorseful. "And I only wanted that assurance. She broke down in tears and told me she didn't want to tell me because she felt like it would ruin everything. "You don't believe this is painful?" I fired back, pretending everything was all right and hiding it from me. "Is that any better?" My mother apologized and grabbed for my hand, but I was unable to take it. I withdrew, feeling as though I had been deceived once more. Not only by Karen, but by my own relatives as well. I had the impression that I had lost all sense of who to trust. Before she could say anything further, I told her I had to have some alone time. I needed time to gather my thoughts so I could decide what to do next. My family had misled me, and my marriage was disintegrating. I got the impression that everything I had ever known had been taken away, and I had no idea where to turn. I spent hours driving around after leaving my mom's house, unsure of where to go or what to do next. Everything felt like it was spinning out of control, and my brain was a complete mess. Really, how was I expected to take it all in? For years, my spouse had been unfaithful to me, and my mother was aware of it but chose to remain silent. It seemed as though everything I held dear had been turned inside out. I parked next to a little park that we used to take the kids to when they were little. I sat there, gazing blankly. I had the impression of being trapped in a bad dream that I couldn't escape. A part of me wanted to return to the house, face Karen once again, and make demands while screaming and yelling. Why she'd thrown away all that the two of us had constructed. However, there was another part of me that felt exhausted, like though I had run out of energy. I had just finished. I spent the following several days in an inexpensive hotel. I didn't disclose my whereabouts to anyone. I required some time to reflect and plan out what I should do next. Karen was asking me to come back so we could chat, and she was flooding my phone with calls and texts. However, I disregarded her. She blew the opportunity to be truthful. I was sick of hearing her justifications. My mother attempted to contact me by leaving voicemails in which she apologized and expressed concern for me, but every time I heard her voice, all I could think about was the time she would lie to me, looking me in the eye while knowing full well that something wasn't right. I was unable to go past that. I was feeling as though someone in my own family had deceived me, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to go past that. I made the decision to pack my luggage and go to Houston on the third day. I needed to visit my girls who were living independently there. Even though they were now adults, they had a right to know what was happening. Karen reaching them first and fabricating a narrative to paint herself as the victim was something I didn't want to happen. That was enough for me, and I wasn't going to let her to control our children. We met in a coffee shop when I arrived in Houston. At first, they seemed delighted to see me, but I could tell they were aware of something being off when they saw the expression on my face. As we sat down, I filled them in on everything. The relationship, how long it had lasted, and how my mother had been aware of it the entire time. I saw the look come over their faces as they realized what was going on. Sarah, my eldest daughter, was upset. She claimed that she had a strange intuition about her mother that occasionally made sense. She also added that on a previous visit to her house, she had witnessed Karen being a little too nice toward a guy, but she dismissed it, figuring it was nothing. She could now understand everything. Mike, my younger one, was more reserved. He seemed pained and bewildered, as if he had no idea how to take it all in. Though I could see the agony in his eyes, I could tell he was making an effort to remain strong. He had always had a stronger bond with Karen, so I knew this would be very painful for him. Knowing that the family my children believed they had was a lie made me feel terrible to watch them go through this. It was as if in some way I had let them down, like I ought to have noticed the warnings sooner. Sarah declared that she was over her mother. She informed me that she had already banned Karen's number and refused to accept any explanations. To be honest, I didn't blame her for being angry. But Mike, he was more conflicted. Even after everything, he still didn't want to break up with his mother. I informed him that he had an option. I cautioned him, but I wasn't going to compel him to choose a side. I was aware of Karen's tendency to fabricate information in order to win him over. I drove back to the house after speaking with the children. I decided it was time to confront Karen once more and handle the next situation. I had to assess our current situation and choose our course for the future, now that all the details were visible. Karen was seated at the kitchen table waiting for me as I stepped in. She appeared disorganized, eyes red, tissues all over. However, I had no sympathy for her. When she spotted me, she stood up and attempted to give me a hug, but I declined. I added, "We need to discuss." She nodded and took a seat again. We just stared at one another for what seemed like an eternity. At last, she began to speak. She continued talking me how she had struggled and felt alone throughout the years that I had been gone, as well as how she had made a mistake. She made an effort to give the impression that it was worthless and that she was only doing it to fill the gap. However, I didn't purchase it. "You have years to be honest with me." "Years," I said. "But you decided to lie instead." She apologized repeatedly, stating that she didn't want to lose me and that she didn't want to harm me. However, the more she spoke, the more it became clear to me that her only fear was losing her affluent existence. It has nothing to do with me. It has to do with money and security. Now I was able to see right through her, and I no longer had any faith in her at all. "How many others were aware of the affair?" I questioned her. Her hesitation told me everything my mother was aware of. Correct. Even though I already knew the answer, I still asked. She nodded and said, "I promise not to say anything," adding that my mom found out a few years ago. She declared her intention to keep the family intact. It felt like a punch to the gut, according to Karen. When I heard that justification once more, it seemed as though they were trying to protect me from the truth. I was done at that point. I informed her I was going as soon as I stood up and gathered my belongings. She was weeping and pleading with me to remain as she tried to follow me, but I was no longer able to look at her. I informed her that I needed time alone and that I wouldn't be returning until I decided what I wanted to do next. I wasn't prepared to discuss divorce or the future of the house. All I wanted to do was go. I was relieved and angry at the same time as I drove back to the motel. First time in a very long time. I felt like I was in charge of my life once more. I had no idea what lay ahead, but at least I was done acting as though nothing was wrong when it obviously wasn't. I made the decision to stop giving Karen money. Should she choose to remain at that residence, it would be up to her to sort it out. I could no longer stand by her side while she took advantage of my labors and secretly deceived me. I informed my girls over the phone about my plans. Sarah was completely in favor of it. Karen must accept the repercussions of her conduct, she argued. Mike appeared to be having difficulty with it as he became more reserved. I informed him that although helping his mother was a decision he had to make, I would no longer be involved. He had to get the facts so he could decide for himself. That's the current state of affairs. I'm still in the motel attempting to decide what to do. While a part of me wants to pack up and return to Dubai in order to remove myself from this disaster as much as possible, another part of me understands that running away won't make things better. I'm not quite sure how, but I need to confront it head on. I'm trying to digest everything and choose what's best for my kids and myself right now, so I'm just taking things day by day. I quote, "I'll try to bring it up as often as I can, but I have no idea how this will turn out. All I know is that I'm tired of being duped and of having other people make decisions about my life." Story 4. My stepmother persuaded my father that I was lying. She was lying to him, so he ended my therapy. "Hello, my name is 16 years old. Pretty mediocre, I suppose. Aside from this persistent chronic condition that has been a continual source of chaos in my life from childhood, it has always been just my dad and myself, Greg. He's been my rock since my mom died away when I was little. He makes sure I have my medications, drives me to all of my doctor's appointments, and is there for me no matter what. Since I can remember, we've been like this little team, and to be honest, I couldn't ask for a nicer father. Really, life was kind of okay. Despite everything going on in the medical field, it wasn't flawless, after all. Even if I occasionally ended up spending a week in the hospital or missing a lot of school, I always knew that my dad would support me. Then everything changed a few months ago. Dad worked with this woman, Samantha. She entered our lives with the force of a whirlwind, and I found it cool at first. My dad should be delighted, after all. He's been through a lot. I wasn't sure what to anticipate when he initially introduced me to her. After all, we had been together for so long that the thought of someone new entering the picture seemed strange. Samantha, though, first appeared to be well. She appeared amiable, as though she was trying. She would bring these tiny presents or refreshments around, as if she were making a great effort to leave a positive impression. She was everything at once. "How about we enjoy a boys' night together, Evan? We may watch a movie or play some video games. Whatever suits your needs." I recall thinking, this woman is really making an effort. Quite frankly, I enjoyed it. Having another person make an effort to participate was comforting. She also brought back a grin to my dad's face that I hadn't seen in a while. And yes, I did comply because I think I was a little yearning for the feeling of a typical family. However, as time passed, I became aware of small things that bothered me. Have you ever had the uneasy sense that something is amiss but are unable to pinpoint it exactly? That's how it kind of was. Her kindness occasionally seemed a touch forced, as though it were all a performance. She once said, "Evan, how about this weekend? Let's grab some burgers and fries. Only the two of us." I was all for it when she said it while grinning broadly. She continued, though, by saying that it's crucial to establish trust and all that, particularly because I could be here for a while. I was kind of thinking about that final line. Really, I hadn't even considered the possibility of her being here permanently. Although it seemed a little strange, as if she were trying something new, I ignored it. Perhaps she was anxious, I reasoned, or trying too hard. It's not exactly simple to meet someone's child, after all. After a few months, Samantha began to appear more frequently. She had begun spending our evenings together, preparing supper and making an effort to get to know me better. I quote, "LL, be honest." It was pleasant at times. She would inquire about my friends, school, and other things, and I would think, well, maybe she's just trying to be a kind person. On other occasions, though, she had a certain edge. It seemed as if she was forcing herself to fit in, which wasn't natural. The day that turned everything around then arrived. Dad had this expression on his Saturday afternoon face, as though he were going to say something significant. "Could you just spend a moment in the living room, Evan?" He yelled, and as I entered, he was bending over and extending a ring. Samantha had the broadest smile I had ever seen as she stood there. "How do you feel, friend? What is your opinion on Samantha becoming your stepmother?" I recall having the impression that my brain was malfunctioning. She had certainly been around for a while, but marriage happened quickly, too quick. However, I noticed my father's optimism when I glanced at him. I simply lacked the motivation to ruin that for him. I faked a grin then. "I'm glad if she makes you happy, Dad." That concluded everything. In that very moment. They had gotten engaged. After then, everything happened at breakneck speed. 1 month later was the planned wedding date. Tiny, simple, simply family and close friends. To be honest, I was too busy to really think about what was going on. Dad and I were the only two of us 1 minute, and then we were a family. Samantha moved in permanently after the wedding. It wasn't too horrible at first. She was still making an attempt to be polite, after all. During our family dinners, Grandma would inquire about my day and the things I was studying in school. But occasionally she would say something that seemed strange. She once quipped, "Well, it's not like you're going to solve world peace, but at least you're learning something." While we were discussing this historical project I was working on, it may not seem like much, but it had a dismissive feeling to it. She seemed to say all the correct things, but her tone wasn't appropriate. I began to question whether she genuinely cared about my dad and myself. Perhaps she was just drawn to the concept of belonging to a family. You're aware? However, I wasn't truly affected by anything until one evening when I heard her conversing with her father in the kitchen. Greg, "I just want to make sure Evan likes me," she said as I was heading down to get a drink of water. "It matters to me that I'm welcomed here." Dad was quick to comfort her, telling her things like, "Sam, you've been great, of course he likes you." She didn't seem relieved when I peered around the corner, though. It resembled a computation more, as if she were putting him to the test. With a calm retreat, I had an odd knot in my gut. I wanted to think she was sincere, that she genuinely thought about my father and me, but there was a discrepancy. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if there was something genuine going on, so I didn't bring it up with my dad. The atmosphere in the house changed as the days passed. Samantha was still pleasant and amiable, but I noticed that she occasionally seemed to be observing me closely. "Evan, do you ever feel like you want a change in your life?" she would ask. "Something distinct?" She seemed to be fishing for something. However, I was unaware of what I had begun to withhold from others. Either staying late at school or visiting my friend Jake's house. The sooner I leave home, the better. However, it was difficult since, well, I lived there. My dad continued to behave as though everything was fine, and I didn't want to be the one to point this up to him. However, that uneasy sensation in my stomach persisted. In retrospect, I believe that's when things truly started to become bad, even if at the time I wasn't really aware of it. However, you are aware of how things are. Sometimes the warning signs are hidden until they are directly in front of you. After the wedding, things ought to have seemed like they were finally settling down after a few months. However, the reality is that I wasn't comfortable with something. I made an effort to ignore it and told myself that I was simply getting used to all the changes. However, it seemed as though strange events began to occur more frequently as time went on. I was trying my hardest to make things work with Samantha, my new stepmother, who had moved in entirely. I would comply with family meals, respond to her inquiries about school, and attempt to look engaged when Mom inquired about my friends or interests. But even though she made an effort to be kind and encouraging, there was a feeling that I couldn't get rid of. It seemed as though she was acting, you know? It felt as though everything she said was staged to sound pleasant. While Samantha, my father, and I were having dinner one evening, Samantha began inquiring about my intentions for college. "Have you given your post-high school plans any thought, Evan? Any university is a target for you." With a real smile on her face, she inquired. "Yes, I have been thinking about it," I informed her. "Perhaps there is something in it, or the study of computers." She gave a nod, although her smile narrowed somewhat. "That's fantastic. But let's face it, college costs are high. This is a major choice." The moment she said it, I felt a little strange. Indeed, I am aware that attending college is costly, but her tone seemed to be hinting at something. However, Dad stepped right in, seeming enthusiastic, adding, "Evan, we'll figure it out." "Forget about the money." Samantha grinned once again, but not until it reached her eyes. "Naturally, we will." She spoke, but there was a sharp edge to her voice. I couldn't decide if it was all in my head or if there was a genuine problem. A few weeks later, I noticed Samantha was much more present, almost as if she were always there, regardless of the time I arrived home. Yes, she currently resides with us, but it felt like she was monitoring everything all the time. When I returned from Jake's place one day, Mom was rummaging through some bills at the kitchen table. She grinned again when she saw me. "Oh, Evan, there you are," the tight smile murmured. "I was just discussing our finances with your father. We underestimated how tight things would be." I felt her eyes on me the entire time, so I just nodded and went to get a food. She seemed to be assessing me, even though I tried not to let it bother me. I overheard her chatting to her father in their room later that evening. I wasn't listening in, at least not initially. However, I overheard a portion of their talk as I passed their door. "Greg, we must use common sense. We're not exactly flush with cash, and Evan's medical expenditures are mounting." Samantha mentioned that my dad seemed to be attempting to soothe her by speaking in a hushed tone. "Sam is my son. I'll figure out how to make it happen. We quote, "L get by." After a little silence, her sigh was audible to me. Very theatrical. "I simply want to be sure that this isn't going to be a financial burden for us." It was as if I had been sucker punched. I knew my medical supplies were expensive. I'm not a moron. However, it hurt to hear her discuss it as though I were a financial burden. She is, after all, meant to be my stepmother, right? I mean, shouldn't she be more concerned about my recovery than the expense? Things took an even stranger turn. After a couple days, I had a terrible stomachache when I woke up in the middle of the night. I felt as though everything was on fire within. In an attempt to get to the restroom, I staggered out of bed and collapsed in the hallway. "Dad, please assist." My voice broke from the anguish as I yelled. I briefly felt relieved when Dad ran over, as if he would somehow make things work out. However, Samantha appeared behind him, appearing somewhat annoyed and half-sleepy. "What is happening?" Rubbing her eyes like if I had just woken her up for nothing, she asked. "Dad is hurt by it. I believe that there is a serious issue," I said, holding into my side. Samantha merely crossed her arms, but Dad had a troubled expression. "Maybe we should wait it out, Greg. Teens may be very theatrical, as you are aware." She stated it with such casualness, like if I were lying or something. Dad stopped for a fraction of a second, as if he was truly thinking about what she had said, and I saw it on his face. I experienced a panic attack because I needed assistance immediately. When my father eventually answered, "No, we're going to the hospital," he picked me up and hurried me to the vehicle. I noticed Samantha's face as I peered over his shoulder. She felt no fear nor anxiety. She appeared irritated, as though my suffering was only a minor annoyance. She seemed irate, like if I were bothering my father or something. In the hospital, when the physicians examined me. Outside my room, I could hear Dad and Samantha fighting. "These costs are going to be enormous, Greg. Are you certain that he isn't overreacting in this instance, just one of those?" I could hear my dad becoming frustrated, she muttered. "Samantha, our boy hurts. It's not exaggerated. This is what we're doing." I should have been relieved when she added, "our son," right? It seemed as like she wanted to include me or something. But it seemed so forced the way she said it. She didn't seem to be serious at all. As I lay there, connected to several IVs and monitors, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sense that something terrible was going to happen. I was caught in the midst of what seemed to be a developing storm. After doing several tests and adjusting my medication, the physicians were able to gradually reduce my discomfort. But even when they released me, I couldn't shake the uneasy sensation. The journey home in the automobile was completely silent. Samantha simply glanced out the window, but Dad kept gazing at me via the rearview mirror, and I could see he was frightened. Her face was entirely expressionless. She went straight to the kitchen as soon as we arrived home, like if nothing had occurred. She responded, "I'll make tea," but her voice was icy. I thought for a second that maybe Dad would talk to me about what had occurred as he assisted me to my room, inquire about my mood or whatever. But he only offered me a brief "Instead, go downstairs, friend, and get some sleep." I laid in bed and looked up at the ceiling. I kept thinking about Samantha's attitude toward me when I was in the hospital, as if I were a bother. I had the impression that I was being marginalized in my own house. The hardest thing was that I was unsure of how to approach my father about it. Really, what was I meant to say? "Dad, hello. I don't think your new wife genuinely loves me." It's not exactly an enjoyable discussion to have. I attempted to go to sleep that night, but my thoughts wouldn't stop going. I couldn't stop thinking about Samantha's expression. It was so disconnected and icy. It was nonsensical. It seemed like she was determined to make me feel like an outsider, even though I'd been trying so hard to get along with her to make this whole family thing work. Things had returned to normal by the next morning. Samantha pretended as if nothing had occurred, preparing breakfast and having a conversation with Dad as though we were a little ideal family. However, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sensation I had, and for the first time I began to question whether this was only the beginnings of something far more serious. Okay, so things didn't get better after that hospital night. Actually, things grew worse. Samantha had a distinct mindset, as if she had given up attempting to disguise it. She used to roll her eyes or mutter something under her breath if I felt uncomfortable or ill. "And your father?" He was still making an effort to maintain composure, but Samantha seemed to be controlling him. He didn't challenge me as much as he used to, and I always had the impression that he was always doubting my statements. I woke up one morning feeling the same recognizable ache in my gut. It kept me in bed even though it wasn't as horrible as it had been previously. I yelled out to my dad, but it was Samantha who appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and leaning against the frame. "Evan, what now?" she asked, clearly displeased by the tone in which she inquired. I tried to sit up but felt a searing ache go through me. I remarked, "I don't feel good. I believe I should spend the day at home." Samantha let out a sigh, as if I had just asked her to perform the most annoying task imaginable. "Evan, you cannot continue to skip school due to a minor tummy discomfort. Too much has already been missed." I attempted to clarify, but she refused to listen. She approached, took the blankets off of me, and told me to get dressed. "You have school today." She had this icy look on her face as she watched me struggle out of bed, as if she didn't give a damn whether I was truly hurt. She seemed to be waiting for me to make a mistake so she could attack. I tried to ignore the stinging pain in my side as I stammered toward the restroom. I went back to my room to change into my clothes. I felt like I was battling this war at school by myself after she departed. I moved Jake to the side. He's been my best buddy for as long as I can remember, so I wanted to inform someone about what was going on. He would understand it if anybody could. I remarked, "Dude, this is getting worse. When I tell Samantha that I'm in agony and my dad isn't helping, she won't believe me." Jake's eyes got bigger. "Man, that's messed up. You really don't feel well. I mean, I've seen how awful it can become." Leaning in, he peered around to make sure no one else was listening. "We have to take action. You're not able to just endure this. However, what? Feeling absolutely powerless, I asked. My dad's word is superior to mine. Furthermore, Samantha is entangling him in her grasp. After pausing momentarily, Jake snapped his fingers as if he suddenly had a bright idea. "Man, we need evidence. We need to document what's happening at home. Maybe we can obtain some aid if we can provide evidence of how she is treating you." I wasn't sure what to think at first. It seemed excessive, don't you think? However, the more I considered it, the more sense it made. When Samantha was alone herself, she would let up on her act, but when my dad was there, she would put on a show and pretend like she cared. Perhaps if I could get a video of her or record her speaking all she usually says, My dad could come to understand what was going on. I chose to give it a try the next day. I switched on the audio recorder on my phone and placed it in my pocket. Samantha, whenever I was in the area. I knew that was the only way I could expose the truth, even though it felt strange and like I was a spy in my own home. To be really honest, I was desperate. I needed someone to accept my story. My first few attempts were not very successful. I would answer, waiting for her to say something awkward, to which she would react in her phony, polite manner. However, she didn't. It seemed as though she was aware. But then I struck it fortunate one afternoon. Samantha entered the living room where I was working on my schoolwork. Her face contorted into an irritated grimace when she noticed me resting on the couch and appeared exhausted. "Evan, are you really simply hanging around once more?" Her question was laced with sarcasm. "You seem to be unwell or fatigued all the time. Ever consider the possibility that you're simply being lazy?" My rage was building, but I realized that if I wanted to capture more, I had to keep my calm. I tried to maintain a steady tone as I said, "I'm not lazy. I simply don't feel good." Her eyes rolled. "Yes, because you're always infected. Perhaps you ought to attempt challenging yourself rather than constantly playing the victim." I knew I had something at that very instant. I sincerely hoped that the recorder, which was still recording, captured everything. However, it didn't end there. I heard her talking on the phone a few days later. Since I was in the hallway and she was in the kitchen, I switched on the recorder silently and listened. Yes, today I moved the funds. No, she was expressing. Greg believes it's all related to Evan's medical care. He is clueless. My heart began to race. What kind of money was she referring to? Furthermore, why did she mislead my dad about it? I ducked in closer, taking care to be silent. She went on, "Just make sure everything's set up on your end. I want everything to be finished. I was hearing things that I couldn't believe. She's actually robbing us of our money. And why?" Before she could see me, I pressed the recorder's stop button and turned to go. "I spent the evening at Jake's house. I had to tell him what I had discovered." "I got her, dude," I remarked, displaying the tapes to him. "She's not simply treating me badly, she also steals money." As he listened, Jake's eyes widened. "Whoa, this is really getting serious. Someone who is truly capable of taking action has to be notified of this. We chose to inform our instructor, Mrs. Lopez. She's protected me from the beginning. She's also the type of person that doesn't tolerate foolishness of any kind." Jake and I visited her classroom over lunch the following day. "Mrs. Lopez, you are needed here." I spoke, a little trembling in my voice. With worry, she raised her gaze. "Evan, what's going on?" I inhaled deeply and opened out to her. Samantha, S treatment of me. The audio I heard on the phone and the items I recorded. Mrs. Lopez paid close attention. With each syllable, her expression grew serious. She wasted no time at all when I was done. "This isn't right, Evan. We must take this to a more capable person. The authorities, your physicians, someone. However, I'm afraid," I acknowledged. "What happens if they don't accept me? Or much worse? What happens if Samantha learns?" Mrs. Lopez touched my shoulder with her hand. "Evan, you're acting appropriately. You don't deserve this. Furthermore, you shouldn't have to do this on your own. Together, we'll figure it out." For the first time in a long time, hearing her say that felt like a weight was lifted off my chest. Perhaps there was a way out of this, I thought to myself. Regards, Mrs. Lopez. Feeling a little more optimistic, I said, "I just hope it's sufficient." She gave a nod. "If further proof is required, it is currently sufficient for us to begin posing queries." "Evan, you're stronger than you realize. Never listen to someone who says differently." That day, when Jake and I left her classroom, I had a mixture of anxiety and resolve. We now had a strategy, and although I was terrified about what may come next, I was certain that I would not allow Samantha to continue getting away with this. Not any longer. Things proceeded more quickly than I had anticipated once I spoke with Mrs. Lopez and showed her the tapes. I reasoned that it may take a few weeks or perhaps months before anyone would pay attention to us. She didn't waste any time, though. She informed my physicians of the problem, and before I knew it, I was back in the hospital for another examination. I wasn't sure whether I was prepared for the strange feeling that everything was suddenly moving more quickly. I could see my dad was nervous as he drove me to the appointment. While we waited in the waiting area, he kept gazing at me as if he could read my mind or figure out what was wrong. He was very much, "Are you feeling okay, buddy?" without saying anything, "and we'll overcome this." I could sense something was off, but I wasn't sure how much he knew or whether he was simply being normal for my benefit. I could see the physicians looking at each other and speaking to one another while they conducted a number of tests. Though I was unable to understand what they were saying, I could tell it was bad. I had a sinking sensation in my stomach when one of them approached and began questioning me about things like whether I was taking my medicine on a regular basis and whether someone was keeping an eye on my symptoms at home. When I turned to look at my father, he appeared perplexed, as if he didn't know why they were posing these queries. At that point, one of the physicians disregarded it. While they conversed, I noticed that Dad's countenance changed from one of perplexity to one of rage or even dread. The doctor remained composed, nodding and speaking softly, even though I could see he was arguing back from his constant shaking of the head. Though I couldn't understand what they were saying, their seriousness was obvious. Dad eventually returned to my side. He made an ill-advised attempt at a grin. "Hey, friend, let me explain. They're just being careful. They want to confirm that everything is in order." I could sense there was more to it than that, even though I nodded. If the physicians weren't seriously concerned, they wouldn't have phoned us in this manner. Just as we prepared to go, the physician who had spoken with my father drew me aside. "Evan, please let us know if you have any news on anything going on at home. I'm available for conversation. To ensure that you receive the best treatment possible, it's critical that we are fully informed." My heart was pounding, and while I was afraid, I wanted to tell him everything at once. And what if Samantha knew? What if my father didn't accept me? I pretended everything was all right by just nodding. "Yes, it's all right. I'm picking up my medications and other stuff," I said, attempting to sound authority. Though he didn't seem persuaded, the doctor didn't press the issue. "Fine. Always remember that you may get in touch with us if you need anything." There was a lot of tension in the car on the way home. Dad continued looking at me as if he had something to say, but he stayed silent. I was gazing out the window, pondering the consequences of Samantha discovering the truth. Behind her back, we were conversing with physicians. Since she was already wary of me, I didn't want to aggravate her further. Samantha was there to greet us at our house. In the kitchen she stood. This expression that made my skin crawl was crossed in his arms. How did the physical examination go? With a nonchalant tone, her eyes were frigid as she questioned. Dad tried to grin. "It was all right. Simple, everyday things. He was attempting to be normal, but I could see that he was tense. Turning to face me, Samantha seemed to be putting me to the test. "Did they discover anything new, Evan? You've been visiting the hospital a lot recently, you know." She stated it as though I was pretending to be somebody I'm not. I simply shrugged. "No. They claimed that nothing changed." "All right," she answered, continuing to observe me intently. Surely we would like to avoid needless drama. The days that followed were like treading carefully. More than ever, Samantha seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake or say anything that would reveal the true nature of the situation. I had to exercise caution in hiding my phone and only record when I was positive she wouldn't find out. That is, until one afternoon I heard a phone call that broke my heart. Samantha's voice came from below, and while I was meant to be asleep in my room, I slipped out of my room, opened my door, and climbed the stairs. Her voice was serious and low when she spoke on the phone. "Indeed, I am aware. No, everything is okay with him. Just as obstinate as usual. I want Greg to be completely naive, but he's not." My stomach twisted. She was speaking negatively about my father and myself. I scrambled to get my phone out and pressed the record button as quickly as I could. "For the time being, just remain quiet," she went on. "Today I've transferred more money, an additional $4,000. He believes it's all part of Evans's treatment, but if all goes according to plan, he won't know until it's too late." I lean my back against the wall, heart palpitating so intensely that I'm certain she can hear it. In addition to taking money, she had plans. However, I had no idea what. I knew I had to keep concealed if I wanted this recording, so much as I wanted to storm down there and face her. This demonstrated my need for an item that would tell my father the truth. I made cautious not to make any noise as I hurried back to my room when the call ended. I had the impression that I was skulking around my own home like a spy dot. It was all there when I listened to the recording several times. Speaking about the money and how she was deceiving her father, her voice was as plain as day. That was it. This was the proof we required. I played the recording for Jake and Mrs. Lopez at school the next day. They listened, and as soon as they heard Samantha's voice, I could see the rage on their faces. With a calm yet forceful voice, Mrs. Lopez stated, "This is exactly what we needed. Evan, we're going to report this to the police. You've experienced enough." "Indeed," Jake said. "This is messed up. We have to make sure she is caught red-handed." However, I was afraid. Yes, we finally had the proof, but what if it wasn't sufficient? What would happen if Samantha discovered and was able to talk her way out of it? I had witnessed her ability to put on a show and present herself as the ideal stepmother whenever her father was there. What would happen if she gave the police the same information? Mrs. Lopez remarked, "Evan, you've done everything right." So she must have noticed the concern on my face. We quote, "I'll see to it that this is resolved. Here, you're not the only one." It helped me a little to hear her say that. Still, there was a part of me that felt afraid. Samantha was there acting like everything was all right when I came home that evening, pretending to be the ideal housewife. But now I was aware of this better. I possessed the evidence. I had no idea how this would all work out, but I was prepared for whatever occurred next. It was time to let the truth be known. Okay, so after all of this, assembling the tapes, having a conversation with Mrs. Lopez, and including my closest buddy Jake, I realized that things were becoming serious. Even though we got the proof we required, I was still anxious about what might come next. I had been tense as I paced the house, thinking Samantha would somehow figure out what we were doing at any given time. I was summoned into Mrs. Lopez's office over lunch a few days after I handed her the tape. I was walking down the hall with my heart thumping. Even though I kept assuring myself that everything would be well, my nervousness persisted. When I arrived, Jake was there as well, appearing anxious, and she was seated behind her desk with a serious expression on her face. With a calm but forceful voice, Mrs. Lopez replied, "Evan, we've contacted the authorities. They will be getting in touch with your dad shortly and are treating this matter seriously." Fear was coupled with the rush of relief that washed over me. "What takes place at this point?" I inquired. "What happens if she attempts to get out of it by lying?" Jake leaped right in. "We have the records, dude. She cannot use words to get herself out of this situation. We possess her." Mrs. Lopez gave a nod. "Evan, you've done everything perfectly. It's up to you now to make sure you remain secure." It was comforting to hear that, but I knew it was just the beginning. That day, as soon as I arrived home, I realized something wasn't right. It seemed strange that Dad's car was in the driveway because he typically worked late. My stomach fell out. There was undoubtedly something happening. The anxiety hit me like a wall as soon as I entered the home. Samantha was pacing back and forth, her face red and angry, while Dad sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "You mean that they're looking into us?" Her voice resounded across the room as she yelled, "Greg, this is absurd!" I could see Dad's eyes suffering and his uncertainty as he glanced up at me. "Could you just come in here for a moment, Evan?" With a weary tone, he inquired. I felt like a bug under a microscope for a second as Samantha turned to gaze at me. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to remain calm as I sat down. "What is happening?" I posed the question as though I was ignorant. Dad inhaled deeply. "The Child Protective Services called us. They claimed to have recordings and that someone had reported negligence." I could see the questions circling in his eyes as he gazed at me. Samantha looked enraged. "All of this is a miscommunication. Tell them you're okay, Evan. Inform them that we look out for you. She lost her temper. Every word she spoke seemed to be intended to pierce straight through me because of how harsh her voice sounded. I forcefully gulped. "Dad, I had to have proof, so I videotaped what was going on." I sensed that something was off. With trembling hands, I took out my phone and played the tape she had made about stealing money intended for my medical treatments. Dad, quote, S-face, became pale as Samantha's words filled the room. I retracted my phone from her attempt to take it. "Evan, you little one." Dad interrupted her just as she started. "Samantha, enough already!" He slammed his hand on the table and roared. I had never seen him quite like that. He had such a vengeful expression. However, melancholy was also present, as if everything were collapsing in front of him. Is this accurate? His voice cracking, he questioned. For even a moment, have you been deceiving me while accepting money? Samantha attempted to act like the victim as her expression softened. Greg, you wouldn't believe it. I just wanted to keep things under control. You are aware of the high cost of Evan's medical care. Though I wasn't buying it, I was doing it for us. Dad wasn't either this time. I noticed a shift in his expression as he turned to face me, as if he was at last realizing the truth. His voice hushed. He whispered, Evan, go to your room. I need to speak with Samantha privately. I didn't require 2 reminders. I ran to my room, but I kept the door slightly open to hear what was happening. I should have known better than to listen in on this conversation, but I had to know how it was going to end. Samantha's tone instantly altered as soon as I was out of sight. She was attempting to embellish the tale, claiming that she was only anxious and that she felt helpless. Dad, though, was not having it. Sam, you have been deceiving me. You, quote, have been embezzling money intended for Evan's medical care and putting it toward who knows what. How are you able to accomplish this? She gave a chilly reaction. What I had to do, I did. You weren't thinking clearly because you were so preoccupied with Evan. I was attempting to keep us safe. My hands were squeezing into fists. She continued to act as though this was only for us. As if she hadn't been a constant source of misery in my life. After a long period of silence, I heard my father's voice once more. This time softer. I'm amazed I put my confidence in you. There was a conclusive quality about his voice, as though he was finished. Gather your belongings. By evening, I want you out of this house. Her following words were mainly shouted above the sound of her stomping about the kitchen, so I missed them. My dad was finally defending me, and as I sat there on my bed, I felt a mixture of comfort and anxiety. But terror, as I had no idea what Samantha was going to do next. She was moving stuff around, and I could hear it. It sounded like she was getting ready to go. My dad came to knock on my door a few hours later. Could we chat, Evan? His voice sounded husky as he asked. I gave him a nod and opened the door. He took a seat next to me and looked at the floor for a while as if he was trying to think of anything to say. I apologize, friend. At last he said. I ought to have trusted you. It's my fault that I failed to see what was going on. I could see the shame on his face when he glanced up at me. I let you down. I couldn't think of anything to say and had a knot in my throat. I still had some resentment that it took him so long to see the reality. However, there was also a part of me that was just happy to have him support me at last. I said, It's okay, Dad. Even so, that wasn't entirely acceptable. We'll work things out. For the first time in what seemed like a long time, he nodded. A little sincere smile crossed his face. Yes, we will. Later that evening, I observed Samantha drive off with her car full of suitcases from the window of my bedroom. I was relieved, but I also felt a bit terrible for her. I felt as though something heavy had been removed off my shoulders for the first time. It appeared as though things may genuinely improve. That evening, I got down with my dad and we spoke for hours. We discussed all that had happened since Samantha moved in. Everything I had been feeling yet was afraid to express. It was satisfying to finally let everything out. And he actually paid attention for the first time. It's just you and me from now on, he stated. Together we will overcome this, and I promise that this will not occur again. I felt safer listening to him say that than I have in a long time. Even though I knew things would still be difficult when I went to bed that night, I felt